at the base of two stone statues found at Heracleopolis, the ancient city of the falcon god, the sacred origin point of the pharaonic tradition. Someone carved numbers, not decorative numbers, administrative numbers, the kind of numbers a bureaucracy records when it needs to account for something important. The numbers are carved into the bases of two seated royal figures, found during excavations at the site in the early 20th century of the modern era. Each base is covered with small carved figures of enemies, fallen men, sprawled in the postures of the defeated, and beside the figures, incised in the stone with the same meticulous care that the early hieroglyphic script applied to everything it recorded, are the tallies: 47,209 in one case, 47,209 in another, according to the most widely cited scholarly reading. More than 47,000 enemies, defeated and counted and inscribed in stone on the bases of a king's statues. The king was Khasekhemwy. His name means something like, "the two powers appear," a name that carried in its very formulation the specific political meaning of the moment in which he ruled. He was the last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty of Egypt, ruling approximately 4,700 years ago, in the period shortly before the construction of the first pyramid. He inherited a kingdom that had been torn apart by what appears to have been the most severe internal conflict in the history of the early Egyptian state. He reunified it. He left behind the largest tomb and the most technically sophisticated buildings of any ruler of the first two dynasties. And then he died, and his successor built the step pyramid, and the Old Kingdom began. And Khasekhemwy was, with the comprehensive thoroughness that early Egyptian history tends to produce, almost completely forgotten. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand not just who Khasekhemwy was, but what the specific combination of his political crisis, his military campaign, his reunification of the Egyptian state, and his extraordinary building program reveals about the specific period between the First Dynasty's founding achievements, described in the previous chapter of this series, and the explosive, civilizational efflorescence of the Old Kingdom that built the pyramids. Let that sink in. The person who stands between the foundations of Egyptian civilization and the pyramids, the ruler whose specific reign bridged the gap between the early institutional invention of the First Dynasty and the architectural and administrative ambitions of the Third and Fourth Dynasties, that produced Saqqara and Giza, the pharaoh who, by reunifying a fractured kingdom and building at a scale and a technical sophistication that no previous ruler had approached, created the specific conditions within which the pyramid-building civilization became possible. He is almost unknown outside a small community of specialists in early Egyptian history. His name is difficult to pronounce. His tomb is in a state of partial excavation that has been ongoing for most of the past century and a half. His statues are among the most powerful images of individual royal authority that have survived from the ancient world, and most people who visit the museums that hold them do not know his name. This is the story of Khasekhemwy. It is a story about civil war and reunification, about the invention of monumental architecture, about the specific individual who stood at the hinge between two great periods of Egyptian civilization and held the door between them. It is one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of the ancient world. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. The numbers on the statue bases are the most immediate and most visceral piece of evidence for what Khasekhemwy's reign was actually about. More than 47,000 enemies counted and inscribed in stone, commemorating what appears to have been a specific military campaign. Almost certainly the campaign by which Khasekhemwy ended the civil conflict that had fractured Egypt, defeated the forces opposed to his authority, and made himself the uncontested ruler of the unified state. This was not a symbolic number. Ancient royal inscriptions used impressive numbers as a matter of routine propaganda, but the specific character of this figure, the precision, the lack of obvious rounding, the way it appears on both statues independently as if recording a genuine tally, has led most specialists to treat it as a genuine administrative count rather than a symbolic exaggeration. 47,209 people accounted for. In whatever sense, the early Egyptian administrative tradition accounted for defeated enemies after whatever engagement produced the defeat. That is an extraordinary number for the early 3rd millennium BC for any military operation in the ancient Near East at this period. It implies a conflict of significant scale, a conflict whose resolution required resources and organizational capacity that tell us something important about the specific state of Egyptian political development at the moment Khasekhemwy took the throne, the civil conflict that preceded him, the reunification he accomplished, the building program he launched, the world he left behind when he died, and the step pyramid began to rise. Each of these is a chapter in a story that this account now tells in full. The story begins not with Khasekhemwy, but with the fracture he was called to heal, the specific political crisis of the Second Dynasty that preceded his reign and produced the conditions within which his extraordinary career became possible. The Second Dynasty of Egypt is one of the least understood periods in the entire history of Egyptian civilization. It is not simply that the evidence is thin, though it is thinner than for the First Dynasty, which at least produced the systematically excavated royal tombs at Abydos and the remarkable material culture of Den's reign. The Second Dynasty is poorly understood in a more specific and more disturbing sense. The evidence we have for it suggests that something went significantly wrong with the unified Egyptian state during this period, and the specific nature of what went wrong has been a subject of scholarly debate for more than a century without achieving a fully satisfying resolution. What the evidence does show is this: the smooth institutional development of the First Dynasty, the progressive elaboration of the administrative forms, the building program, the development of the royal ideology, was interrupted during the Second Dynasty by what appears to have been a serious political fracture. The specific character of that fracture is not entirely clear, but the evidence includes the appearance of a religious symbol associated with the god Seth, the divine adversary of Horus, the god whose iconography represented chaos and disruption, in royal names and on royal monuments during the Second Dynasty. It includes evidence of tombs being built at Memphis rather than at Abydos, breaking the First Dynasty burial tradition. It includes what appears to be the disruption or cessation of some of the administrative practices that the First Dynasty had established. And it includes, most dramatically, the evidence associated with two kings whose reigns appear to have been characterized by conflict rather than by the kind of steady institutional development that the First Dynasty had produced. King Peribsen, whose name is written with the Seth animal rather than the Horus falcon that all previous and most subsequent kings used, and the king who preceded Khasekhemwy, variously known as Sekhemket or Khasekhem, represent the specific crisis period of the Second Dynasty. Both figures are imperfectly understood, and the relationship between them and the events of their reigns are still actively debated among specialists. The picture that emerges from the most careful current scholarship is something like this. At some point during the Second Dynasty, possibly in the context of a succession dispute or a religious conflict between the cults of Horus and Seth, the unified Egyptian state fractured. Different rulers controlled different parts of the country. The administrative coherence that the First Dynasty had achieved broke down. The specific institutional forms that Den and his predecessors had established, the nome system, the administrative labels, the royal ideology, were contested or disrupted. Egypt was, in whatever specific form the conflict took, no longer fully unified. The scale of this fracture was almost certainly less complete than later civil conflicts in Egyptian history. The First Intermediate Period, the Second Intermediate Period, that produced genuine multiple competing kingdoms with separate administrative and military apparatuses. But it was a genuine political fracture, significant enough to leave traces in the archaeological record, and significant enough that the specific act of reunification that Khasekhemwy accomplished was remembered and commemorated in the way that his statues and his name and his extraordinary building program demonstrate. The discovery of the specific evidence for the Second Dynasty crisis came gradually across the later 19th and early 20th centuries as the systematic excavation of the principal Second Dynasty sites. Abydos, Hierakonpolis, Memphis produced the material that allowed scholars to begin reconstructing the period. The British archaeologist James Quibble, working at Hierakonpolis at the turn of the 20th century, made some of the most important specific discoveries. The two statues of Khasekhemwy with their carved bases, found in what appears to have been a deposit associated with an early temple precinct, the ivory and stone objects associated with the early royal cult at the site, and the specific architectural remains that gave scholars their first clear picture of pre-Old Kingdom monumental construction. Quibble's excavations at Hierakonpolis in 1897 and 1898 CE were, by the standards of their time, relatively systematic. Quibble had been trained in the specific methodological approach that Petrie had developed, and he brought something of that approach to his work at Hierakonpolis, though the specific conditions of the site and the compressed timeline of his excavations prevented the full application of the most rigorous methods. What he found was enough to transform the scholarly understanding of the pre-Old Kingdom period, and the specific objects he recovered from the site, including the Khasekhemwy statues, remain among the most important sources for understanding the period. But the full reconstruction of the Second Dynasty's specific political history has required the patient accumulation of evidence over more than a century. The systematic analysis of pottery, sequences, the decipherment of the early hieroglyphic inscriptions, the comparison of different site archives, and the application of the increasingly sophisticated analytical techniques that 20th and 21st century archaeology has developed. The picture that has emerged from this accumulation is still incomplete. The Second Dynasty remains the most poorly understood phase of early Egyptian history, but it is considerably better understood than it was when Quibble made his discoveries, and the understanding we have is sufficient to place Khasekhemwy in his specific historical context with reasonable confidence. That context is, as the preceding section indicated, the context of a kingdom in crisis and a ruler charged with ending the crisis. What distinguished Khasekhemwy from the rulers who came before him in the Second Dynasty, and what explains the specific scale of his achievements, is the combination of qualities that the end of a civil conflict tends to produce in successful leaders: the strategic intelligence to understand what the conflict required to resolve, the organizational capacity to deploy the resources of the reunified state toward the specific institutional and building projects that the reunification made necessary, and the specific personal authority that successful military and political victory over a major conflict tends to generate. Khasekhemwy had all of these. The evidence of his reign, the statues, the tomb, the building at Hierakonpolis, the seal impressions and administrative objects, and the extraordinary architectural monuments that his reign produced, is the evidence of a ruler who was fully in command of the organizational capacity of the Egyptian state, and who used that capacity with a combination of ambition and effectiveness that no previous ruler of the first two dynasties had quite matched. He was, in a specific and important sense, the most capable ruler that the early period of Egyptian civilization produced before the great pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom. Understanding why requires understanding what he inherited, what he built, and what he left behind. The inheritance was a fractured kingdom. The building was the most ambitious architectural program in the history of the ancient world up to that point. The legacy was the specific conditions within which the Third Dynasty's Djoser could build the step pyramid, and the Fourth Dynasty's Sneferu and Khufu could build at Giza. Between the foundations and the pyramids, Khasekhemwy stood. The specific political and religious character of the Second Dynasty crisis requires more detailed examination, because understanding the crisis is essential for understanding the specific significance of Khasekhemwy's reunification and the specific form that his commemoration of that reunification took. The Egyptian state, from its founding in the First Dynasty, had been organized around the ideology of the Horus king. The understanding that the pharaoh was the living embodiment of the god Horus, the sky god and son of Osiris, whose authority was the specific divine mandate that justified the king's rule over the unified two lands. The Horus name, written in the Serek, the palace facade enclosure topped with the Horus falcon, was the oldest and most fundamental component of the royal titulary, the name by which the king was identified, in the most ancient form of the pharaonic tradition. The appearance of a Seth name, a name written not with the Horus falcon but with the Seth animal, the unidentified desert creature whose iconography represented the god of chaos, disorder, and the desert, in the royal titulary of the Second Dynasty King Peribsen, is therefore not simply a different naming convention. In the specific symbolic language of the early Egyptian royal tradition, writing the king's name with the Seth animal rather than the Horus falcon was a statement of extraordinary theological significance. It was a declaration that the king's divine identity was not Horus but Seth, not the god of cosmic order but the god of cosmic disruption, not the son of Osiris defending the divine heritage but the adversary of that heritage. Whether this declaration reflected a genuine religious innovation, a deliberate theological reorientation of the royal ideology toward a different understanding of the king's divine nature, or whether it was a political statement about a specific conflict within the Egyptian court or between different regional power centers, is not fully clear from the surviving evidence. The scholarly debate about the specific meaning of Peribsen's Seth name has been running for decades, and while there are competing interpretations, no single interpretation has achieved consensus. What is clear is that Khasekhemwy's response to this situation was itself a statement of extraordinary theological political significance. His name, Khasekhemwy, was written with both the Horus falcon and the Seth animal above the Serek, declaring that both powers appear, that the divine authority of both Horus and Seth was embodied in the king, and his inscriptions explicitly record that he pacified the two lords in him, that he reconciled the conflict between Horus and Seth within his own royal identity. This was a specific and deliberately chosen political theological solution to the specific problem of a kingdom in which two factions, one aligned with the Horus tradition, one apparently aligned with Seth, were in conflict. By taking a name that incorporated both gods, by explicitly declaring the pacification of both divine powers within his person, Khasekhemwy was making the most inclusive possible claim about his own royal authority, that it transcended the specific factional conflict and embodied the full range of divine royal power. The specific intelligence of this move is worth pausing on. In a political situation where the conflict appears to have had a religious ideological dimension, where different factions were apparently associated with different divine traditions, the reunifying ruler who claimed both traditions rather than simply imposing one on the other was choosing the most stable possible basis for the restored unity. He was not declaring the Seth faction defeated and the Horus faction victorious. He was declaring both factions incorporated in his own authority, both reconciled, both represented, both subordinated to the king's comprehensive divine identity. This same political intelligence would characterize the building program of his reign, as this account will describe. The choice to build at sites sacred to both Horus and Seth, the specific architectural language that drew on the earliest traditions of both regions, the comprehensive scope of a building campaign that touched the principal sacred sites of the reunified kingdom, rather than focusing exclusively on sites associated with a single regional or religious tradition. The scale of what Khasekhemwy built is, by the standards of the period preceding him, breathtaking. The Shunet el Zabib, the Raisin House as the local Arab population calls it, the evocative name for a massive mud brick enclosure at Abydos that is the best preserved example of early royal architecture anywhere in Egypt, is Khasekhemwy's construction. It is one of the largest mud brick structures that has ever been built anywhere in the world, and it dates to a period more than a century before the Step Pyramid. Standing at the edge of the desert, behind the town of Abydos, its walls still rising to a height of nearly 10 meters in places, walls of fired mud brick that are themselves more than 5,000 years old. It is the most immediate physical experience of the specific scale of Khasekhemwy's ambitions that any visitor to Egypt can have. The Shunet el-Zabib is not simply large. It is large in the specific way that very deliberate, very organized, very well-resourced ancient constructions are large. Its walls are laid with a precision and a consistency that reflect the systematic organization of skilled labor at a scale that the earlier periods of Egyptian history had not approached. The mud bricks are uniform in size. The walls are built with specific architectural techniques. The characteristic palace facade, paneling, the alternating projections and recesses that decorated the exterior of the most important royal buildings, that were the standard visual vocabulary of elite Egyptian architecture in this period. The enclosure is enormous by any standard, approximately 122 meters by 64 meters in its external dimensions, and its walls, at their original height, would have risen more than 10 meters above the desert surface. What was it for? This is a question that the archaeological evidence has been working to answer for more than a century. The Shunet el-Zabib was excavated by Petrie in the 1890s, examined by subsequent archaeologists across the 20th century, and most recently the subject of systematic investigation by the Pennsylvania Yale Institute of Fine Arts expedition to Abydos, led by David O'Connor, whose work on the funerary enclosures of the early dynastic period has produced the most comprehensive current understanding of what these structures were and how they functioned. O'Connor's analysis identified the Shunet el-Zabib and a group of earlier enclosures at Abydos as funerary enclosures, monumental complexes associated with the royal mortuary cult, where the rituals and ceremonies related to the dead king's divine continuing existence were performed. These were not simply walls surrounding empty space. They were functional cultic structures used for specific ritual purposes associated with the specific theological understanding of royal death and divine transformation that the pharaonic tradition maintained. The funerary enclosures were the institutional expression of the mortuary cult, the ongoing ritual maintenance of the dead king's divine presence in the world of the living, performed in a specific architectural setting designed to provide the appropriate physical context for those rituals. They were also, in the context of the early period, statements of royal power, demonstrations of the scale of resources that the king could mobilize, and the permanence of the institutional arrangements that would sustain the royal cult after the king's death. Khasekhemwy's Shunet el-Zabib was the largest and the most sophisticated of these enclosures. It represented, in its physical scale and its architectural quality, a specific advancement in the ambition of the royal building program that reflected the specific political context of its construction. A ruler who had reunified a fractured kingdom and who was using the organizational capacity of the restored unified state to demonstrate, through the most impressive construction project the ancient world had yet seen, the comprehensive authority and the divine legitimacy of the restored unified kingship. The building was a political statement made in mud brick, and it was a statement of extraordinary effectiveness. The scholar who has perhaps done most to synthesize the specific evidence for Khasekhemwy's reign and his place in the trajectory of early Egyptian civilization is Toby Wilkinson, whose comprehensive treatment of the early dynastic period has been cited throughout this series. Wilkins described Khasekhemwy's reign as the specific hinge point of the early period, the moment when the institutional and ideological foundations of the First Dynasty were consolidated after the Second Dynasty crisis, and the specific institutional capital was accumulated that would allow the Third Dynasty to take the decisive step toward the Old Kingdom's specific achievements. This formulation, the reign as a hinge point, is worth unpacking. Hinge point is not simply a transition. It is a specific moment when two different states of affairs are connected, when the direction of movement changes, when what was accumulating in the previous phase reaches a specific threshold and becomes the basis for what comes next. Khasekhemwy's reign was the hinge between the early period's institutional invention and the Old Kingdom's institutional maturity. The reunification he accomplished was the specific political precondition for the administrative consolidation and the organizational capacity that pyramid building required. Without the reunification, the fragmentation would have continued. Without the consolidation, the organizational capacity would not have been available. Without the organizational capacity, the pyramids would not have been built. The chain of necessary conditions that leads from Khasekhemwy to the pyramids is not the only chain. Many specific historical choices and circumstances contributed to the Old Kingdom's emergence, but it is a real chain, and Khasekhemwy's reunification is its first link. This is the scale of his significance. Between the foundations and the pyramids, the hinge point, the last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty, and, in the most important sense, the first pharaoh of everything that came after. The geographical dimension of the crisis and its resolution deserves explicit attention, because the geography shaped both the conflict and the specific form of Khasekhemwy's response to it. Egypt's geography, the long, narrow Nile Valley with its distinct northern delta region, had always been the foundation of the Egyptian unified state's specific political challenge. The two regions were genuinely different. The valley was a narrow corridor of cultivable land, its communities organized along the river's course. The delta was a broad flood plain with multiple channels and a more dispersed pattern of settlement. The historical and cultural identities of the two regions had their roots in specific pre-dynastic traditions that remained distinct even after political unification. The dual character of the Egyptian kingdom, the two lands, the double crown, the king's titles that explicitly acknowledged the dual nature of the state, was not simply symbolic. It reflected a genuine geographic and cultural duality that the unified state had always had to manage. The Second Dynasty crisis appears to have had a geographic dimension that overlaid the religious ideological dimension. The evidence suggests that Upper Egypt, the southern valley, may have been the primary center of the Seth-associated faction, while Lower Egypt, the delta and the northern administrative center of Memphis, maintained or returned to the Horus tradition. The specific geographic alignment of the conflict is not fully clear, and scholars debate the extent to which the religious dimension and the geographic dimension were correlated or distinct, but the general pattern of a kingdom divided between regional factions is consistent with the evidence. Khasekhemwy's campaign, the campaign commemorated in the carved enemy figures on his statue bases, was almost certainly directed primarily against a specific regional opponent. The inscriptions associated with the statues mention the northern enemy in contexts that suggest the opponents were in the delta or the northern part of the country. If the conflict had a geographic dimension along the lines suggested by the evidence, Khasekhemwy's military campaign was the specific act of reasserting unified royal authority over the region that had resisted it. The choice to build at Hierakonpolis, the ancient sacred city of the Horus tradition, located in the south of the Egyptian Nile Valley, associated with the earliest expressions of the Horus kingship ideology, and at Abydos, the ancestral royal burial ground of the First Dynasty kings, was a choice to anchor the reunified state's identity in the specifically southern, specifically Horus-associated traditions that the First Dynasty had established, but the choice to incorporate the Seth animal in his royal name alongside the Horus falcon was the simultaneous acknowledgement that the northern, Seth-associated traditions also had a place in the reunified state's identity. This is a sophisticated political calculus. Use the southern sacred geography to anchor the restored Horus tradition. Use the theological innovation of the dual name to acknowledge the Seth tradition. Build the most important sites of both traditions. Create, through the combination of military victory and ideological reconciliation, the broadest possible basis for the restored unified authority. Whether this specific calculus was Khasekhemwy's own intellectual achievement, or whether it reflects the contributions of the advisors and officials who surrounded him, or whether it was the specific product of the particular circumstances he faced rather than a deliberately designed political strategy, cannot be determined from the surviving evidence. What can be determined is that the specific combination worked, that the reunification was achieved, maintained, and built upon in ways that produced the specific civilizational trajectory that led to the pyramids. The foundation is now established. The scale is now clear. The hinge point and the man who stood at it are now visible in their full context. The following sections examine the specific evidence for Khasekhemwy's reign. The buildings, the objects, the inscriptions, the tomb, in the detail that the full accounting requires. One more element of the foundation requires attention before this account can move into the specific evidence, the question of chronology, and the specific challenge of placing Khasekhemwy in time with the precision that historical analysis requires. The absolute dating of the Second Dynasty, the assignment of specific calendar years to the reigns of its rulers, remains one of the most contested problems in Egyptian chronology. Current scholarly estimates place the Second Dynasty roughly in the period between 3000 and 2800 BC, with Khasekhemwy's reign falling somewhere in the last few decades of this range. But the specific dates are uncertain enough that any precise figures must be understood as estimates with margins of error measured in decades rather than years. This uncertainty is not simply a technical problem for specialists. It has specific implications for how we understand Khasekhemwy's place in the larger historical picture. If the estimates that place his reign in approximately 2800 to 2700 BC are broadly correct, then his death and the beginning of the Third Dynasty came relatively close to the beginning of the Old Kingdom period. The specific gap between Khasekhemwy's most ambitious building projects and the construction of the Step Pyramid may have been as little as a generation. This proximity is itself significant. The scale of the institutional development that Khasekhemwy's reign represented, the organizational capacity, the administrative reach, the specific building technology, would not have been possible to simply regenerate from scratch within a generation if it had been lost with his death. The implication is that the institutional capacity that built the pyramids was, to a significant degree, the institutional capacity that Khasekhemwy had built and that his successors inherited. The hinge point was not simply a metaphor. The connection between Khasekhemwy's achievements and the Old Kingdoms were real, material, and institutional. The building program he launched was the specific training ground within which the organizational capacity for pyramid construction developed. The administrative consolidation he achieved was the specific foundation on which the Old Kingdom's more extensive administrative apparatus was built. Understanding this connection, understanding how the specific achievements of Khasekhemwy's reign made the subsequent achievements of the pyramid builders possible, is one of the central purposes of this account. It is also the specific insight that the silence around Khasekhemwy's name has most consistently obscured. The full accounting follows. The full accounting begins with a question that the foundation has prepared but not yet answered. What exactly did Khasekhemwy build, and what does the building tell us about the specific character of his reign and his historical significance? The answer to this question is the subject of the following sections. It is an answer that requires examining the physical evidence with the patient attention of an archaeologist, reading the specific details of mud brick courses and foundation deposits and architectural techniques as evidence for the specific organizational and ideological character of the reign that produced them. It is also an answer that requires the specific scholarly expertise of the people who have spent their careers working at the Abydos and Hierakonpolis sites, excavating and analyzing and publishing the evidence with the methodological rigor that the period demands. This account draws on that expertise, presenting its most important conclusions in the form of the story they tell about a specific human being who lived more than 4,700 years ago, and whose specific achievements stand at the beginning of everything that is most recognizable about ancient Egyptian civilization. The story begins with the Shunet el-Zabib, with the walls that are still standing, with the mud brick that has survived 5,000 years of Egyptian desert sun and seasonal flooding, and the patient work of time itself. The story begins with something that is still there, still visible, still capable of making anyone who stands beside it understand, in the most immediate physical sense, what Khasekhemwy was and what he built. Those walls stand in the desert, behind Abydos. They have been standing for more than 5,000 years. Let that sink in, and let the story begin. 5,000 years. 5,000 years of standing in the desert, the mud brick walls of the Shunet el-Zabib, carrying within them the specific organizational intelligence, the specific political intention, the specific civilizational moment of Khasekhemwy's reunification of the Egyptian state, standing there before the Old Kingdom began, standing there while the Old Kingdom built its pyramids, standing there through the intermediate periods, and the New Kingdom, and the Late Period, and the Ptolemaic synthesis, and all the subsequent history that this series has been tracing. Still standing now, in the 21st century of the modern era, visible to anyone who makes the trip to the desert behind the town of Abydos and looks at what 5,000 years of survival looks like in mud brick and determination. The pharaoh who built those walls deserves to be known. The building program and the political achievement and the specific historical significance that the walls represent deserve their full accounting. That accounting now begins. The core problem of Khasekhemwy's reign, the deepest challenge he faced, and the deepest question his story raises, is the problem of continuity after fracture. It is a specific and demanding challenge. Most rulers who inherit stable kingdoms face the challenge of maintaining what was built before them and adding to it. The specific challenge of a ruler who inherits a fractured kingdom is different. Not maintenance, but restoration. Not building on an intact foundation, but first rebuilding the foundation, and then building on it before the restoration cement has fully dried. The fracture of the Egyptian state during the Second Dynasty was not simply a political inconvenience. It was a crisis of the specific institutional forms that Den and the other First Dynasty rulers had worked so hard to establish, forms that depended, for their functioning, on the specific assumption of a unified state administered by a single royal authority, whose divine mandate was comprehensive and uncontested. A fractured state was not simply a state with a political dispute. It was a state whose foundational legitimacy claim, the claim that the king's divine authority extended over the full unified two lands, was in active contest. Resolving the fracture required more than military victory. It required the specific reconstruction of the legitimacy claim in a form that the reunified kingdom could accept. A form that addressed the specific theological political challenge that the Second Dynasty's Seth-associated rulers had embodied, that acknowledged the reality of the conflict without simply declaring one side victorious and the other defeated, and that created the broadest possible basis for a genuinely restored unity, rather than a temporarily imposed one. Khasekhemwy achieved this. The evidence of how he achieved it, the dual name, the building program, the specific sites he chose, and the specific forms he built, reveals a governing intelligence of remarkable sophistication, operating in conditions of political crisis, with the specific combination of military effectiveness and ideological creativity that the crisis required. But understanding the achievement requires first understanding the problem in its full depth, and the full depth of the problem goes beyond the political and the ideological into the specifically material and institutional dimension that is, in many ways, the most practically important. The Second Dynasty fracture did not simply interrupt the ideological continuity of the Egyptian state, it interrupted the institutional continuity, the specific administrative practices, the building programs, the commercial networks, the specific forms of royal patronage and priestly accommodation that had sustained the social and economic functioning of the unified kingdom. When a state fractures, the specific institutional infrastructure that sustains its complexity begins to decay. The administrators who maintain the records take sides or stop showing up. The building projects are suspended as resources are redirected to military purposes. The commercial networks that depended on state stability and state protection begin to contract. The specific community of skilled craftsmen and administrators and priests who maintain the institutional forms of the royal tradition scatter or reorganize around different patrons. Restoring this institutional infrastructure after reunification is genuinely difficult work. It requires the specific recognition of what has been damaged, the specific assessment of what remains functional and what needs to be rebuilt, and the specific organizational intelligence to deploy the resources of the restored state toward the most critical needs in the right sequence. Too much attention to the symbolic and ideological dimension, too much focus on demonstrating the restored legitimacy through impressive public works, at the expense of the practical institutional rebuilding can produce a state that looks restored but is not functionally restored. Too much attention to the practical institutional rebuilding at the expense of the symbolic and ideological dimension can produce a state that functions adequately but lacks the specific legitimacy, energy that sustains the pharaonic ideology and motivates the extraordinary organizational efforts that pyramid building required. Khasekhemwy appears to have struck this balance correctly. The evidence of his reign shows both the symbolic and ideological dimension, the dual name, the building at the principal sacred sites, the commemoration of military victory in the statues with their carved enemy figures, and the practical institutional dimension, the administrative records, the building technology that implied the development of sophisticated organizational capacity, the specific scale of the construction projects that required the mobilization of labor and resources from across the reunified kingdom. The balance is itself one of the most significant things about his reign. It is the balance that the subsequent Old Kingdom would maintain. The combination of monumental building as demonstration of divine royal authority with the sophisticated administrative infrastructure that made the building possible, and it was worked out in its early form by Khasekhemwy in the specific conditions of the Second Dynasty's aftermath. Here is the deeper dimension of the core problem, and it is worth sitting with carefully. The fracture of the Second Dynasty was not simply a crisis of the specific Egyptian state. It was a crisis of the specific institutional model, the divine kingship model, the unified state model, the specific combination of religious authority and administrative capacity that Egypt had been developing since the First Dynasty. When that model fractured, the question that the fracture raised was not simply, who would win the political conflict? The deeper question was, would the model itself survive? Or would the Second Dynasty's fracture be the beginning of a permanent dissolution? The end of the unified Egyptian state as a viable institutional form, the splitting of the Nile Valley into the permanently divided regional kingdoms that it had been before the First Dynasty's unification. Khasekhemwy's answer to this question was not simply military or political. It was institutional, the specific demonstration, through the breadth and the scale and the sophistication of his building program, that the unified Egyptian state was not only restored, but was now more capable, more organizationally sophisticated, more architecturally ambitious, more administratively coherent than it had been before the fracture. The fracture had not simply been healed. It had been healed in a way that made the restored state stronger than the state that had fractured. This is the specific character of his achievement that makes him extraordinary, rather than simply important. He did not just restore, he advanced. The building program he launched was not simply a demonstration of restored authority. It was a genuine development of the institutional capacity that the Egyptian state had been building since the First Dynasty, carried forward to a new level of scale and sophistication that the previous period had not achieved. And it gets stranger still. The specific character of the buildings Khasekhemwy produced, the scale, the architectural techniques, the material choices, the organizational demands they represented, were not simply the largest and most sophisticated buildings of the early period. They were the specific precursors of the architectural and organizational innovations that the step pyramid represented. The connection between Khasekhemwy's building program and Djoser's revolutionary construction is not simply temporal, it is institutional, material, and specific. Djoser's step pyramid was not built by people who had no experience of building at this scale. It was built by people who, or whose teachers' teachers, had built the Shuna el-Zibib and the tomb at Abydos and the other structures of Khasekhemwy's reign. The organizational knowledge, the building techniques, the administrative practices that sustained large-scale construction projects. These were the specific inheritance that Khasekhemwy's reign passed to the Third Dynasty. The core problem was, how do you restore a fractured civilization and set it on the path to the pyramids? Khasekhemwy's answer was to build at a scale and a sophistication that the previous period had not attempted, to demonstrate through the most immediate and most powerful available medium, monumental architecture, that the restored unified Egyptian state was not simply restored, but transformed. More capable, more organized, more ambitious, and more divine than anything that had come before. He built. The buildings survive. The answer they represent is visible in their scale, their quality, and their specific architectural innovations. The following sections examine each of the major elements of his building program in the detail that the full understanding requires. The specific organizational challenge of large-scale building in the early 3rd millennium BC is itself worth examining in detail because it illuminates what Khasekhemwy's building program actually demonstrates about the institutional capacity of the Egyptian state at this period. Large-scale mud brick construction, the specific technology of the Shunet el-Zabib and the other enclosures of the early period is not as organizationally demanding as stone construction. Mud brick can be produced locally from the Nile mud that is abundantly available throughout Egypt. Its production does not require the specialized quarrying operations, the long-distance transportation networks, or the specific stoneworking skills that stone construction demands. In this sense, the mud brick construction of the early period was more accessible than what would come later, but this does not mean it was organizationally simple. The Shunet el-Zabib required the production of tens of millions of individual mud bricks, each one mixed, formed, dried, transported to the building site, and laid by skilled bricklayers who understood the specific techniques of large-scale mud brick construction. The coordination of this labor, the management of the supply chains, the oversight of the construction quality, the specific organizational intelligence that kept tens of thousands of brick producers and bricklayers working in the right sequence at the right pace. This was genuinely demanding administrative work, and the organizational challenge was not limited to the brickwork. The Shunet el-Zabib also incorporated timber roofing elements that had to be sourced, probably from Levantine forests, since Egypt's native timber was insufficient for large-scale construction, transported by sea and river, and worked by carpenters with specific skills. The architectural detailing of the facade, the specific pattern of projections and recesses that constituted the palace facade decoration, required the consistent application of a design template across an enormous surface, demanding both the template itself and the organizational capacity to apply it consistently. This organizational complexity was not managed by a king working alone with a handful of advisors. It was managed by an administrative apparatus of considerable sophistication, an apparatus of scribes and overseers and specialized craftsmen and workers' supervisors that was itself one of the most important institutional achievements of the early Egyptian state. Understanding that Khasekhemwy's building program required and demonstrated this organizational apparatus is essential for understanding the specific significance of his reign. The buildings were not simply impressive structures. They were the evidence of a functioning administrative state of considerable institutional depth, a state capable of mobilizing and coordinating the resources of the reunified kingdom for a sustained, large-scale building program. This is the institutional evidence for the reunification's success, not the military victory, which was commemorated in the statue bases, not the theological innovation of the dual name, which was expressed in the royal titulary. The institutional evidence was the building itself, the specific demonstration, in mud brick and timber and skilled labor, that the Egyptian state was now capable of the organizational achievements that a large-scale construction program required. The tomb at Abydos, designated Tomb V in the scholarly literature, is the second major architectural monument of Khasekhemwy's reign, and it represents a different dimension of the period's building achievements from the Shunet el-Zabib, where the Shunet el-Zabib was a funerary enclosure, a monumental structure associated with the mortuary cult, but not the actual burial place. The tomb was the actual burial place, the specific physical space within which the king's body was placed, and the specific goods associated with his eternal existence were deposited. The tomb at Abydos is the largest of all the early royal tombs at the site. Its underground chambers, excavated into the desert bedrock, lined with mud brick, divided into multiple rooms, represent a substantial development in both scale and complexity from the First Dynasty royal tombs. And it contains one specific feature that is, from the perspective of architectural history, one of the most significant innovations of the period: stone-built chambers within the tomb. The use of stone in royal tomb construction, not just in architectural detailing or floor surfaces, as in Den's granite floor, but in the actual structural chambers, was an innovation of Khasekhemwy's reign. The tomb contains stone-lined chambers whose construction anticipated, in a preliminary form, the specific use of stone in the Old Kingdom pyramid complexes, the specific material choice, limestone, the primary building material of the Old Kingdom, and the specific structural application. Stone used to line and roof burial chambers were the direct precursors of what Djoser's architect Imhotep would develop into a fully articulated stone architecture. The transition from mud brick to stone construction is one of the most important technological transitions in the history of architecture, and it is a transition that happened in Egypt in the early 3rd millennium BC, across the period bracketed by Khasekhemwy's tomb at Abydos and Djoser's step pyramid at Saqqara. Khasekhemwy's tomb represents the beginning of this transition, the first systematic use of stone in a royal burial context in a way that anticipated the full stone architecture of the Old Kingdom. This is a specific and documented architectural historical fact, not a speculative claim. The stone chambers of Khasekhemwy's tomb are there, in the archaeological record, datable to his reign with reasonable confidence by the seal impressions and pottery found in association with the tomb. And the step pyramid at Saqqara is there, datable to Djoser's reign with high confidence, representing the full realization of the architectural ambition that the stone chambers of Khasekhemwy's tomb began to express. The connection is specific and real, and it is the connection that most directly illustrates the specific significance of Khasekhemwy's place in the history of Egyptian civilization. The ruler whose building program included the first architectural use of stone in a royal context, whose reign therefore stands at the beginning of the specific architectural tradition that produced the Old Kingdom's most celebrated achievements. And it gets more significant still. The specific person who is most directly associated with the transition from Khasekhemwy's reign to the step pyramid is Imhotep, the architect of Djoser's step pyramid, later deified as a god of wisdom and medicine, one of the most celebrated individuals in the entire history of Egyptian civilization. Imhotep did not invent stone construction from scratch. He developed and elaborated a building tradition that already existed. A tradition that included the stone chambers of Khasekhemwy's tomb and the specific organizational capacity that Khasekhemwy's reign had developed. The connection between Khasekhemwy and Imhotep, between the last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty and the architect of the first pyramid, is not direct in the sense that they necessarily knew each other personally, but it is direct in the institutional sense. The organizational capacity and the architectural tradition that Imhotep built on were the specific inheritance of Khasekhemwy's reign. The most extraordinary thing about Khasekhemwy's historical significance is not any single achievement. It is the specific combination of achievements: the reunification, the dual name, the building program, the stone chambers, the organizational capacity development, that together placed him at the specific hinge point between two great periods of Egyptian civilization. Before Khasekhemwy, institutional invention, some organizational fragility, and the specific crisis of the Second Dynasty fracture. After Khasekhemwy, the consolidated state, the developed organizational capacity, the building tradition that led directly to the pyramids. At the hinge, the man himself, reunifying the fractured kingdom, building at unprecedented scale, incorporating stone in ways that no previous ruler had, and leaving behind the specific institutional and material inheritance that the Old Kingdom would develop into the most ambitious construction program the ancient world had yet seen. The core problem was continuity after fracture. The solution was reunification combined with building, the specific demonstration, through the largest and most sophisticated construction program of the early period, that the restored unified state was not simply restored but transformed into something more capable than what had fractured. The solution worked. The pyramids were built, and Khasekhemwy, who stood at the beginning of the chain that made them possible, has been all but forgotten. The forgetting is the specific injustice that this account is working to correct. The correction begins in the following sections, with the specific evidence examined in the full detail it deserves. The specific evidence for the Second Dynasty crisis. The evidence that makes the conflict that preceded Khasekhemwy's reunification more than simply a scholarly inference deserves its own careful examination, because it is this evidence that most directly establishes the stakes of what Khasekhemwy accomplished. The most important single piece of evidence for the Second Dynasty conflict is the set of administrative sealings from the site of Shunet-el-Zabib itself. Sealings impressed into clay from administrative cylinder seals found in the fill of the enclosure during the excavations conducted by the Yale, Pennsylvania expedition in the 1980s and 90s of the modern era. These sealings represent the administrative records of a specific royal administration, and the names and titles they record allow scholars to identify the specific officials and the specific royal authority associated with the construction of the enclosure. What the sealings show is that the Shunet-el-Zabib was built by Khasekhemwy's administration, that the organizational apparatus that managed its construction was specifically his court. This may seem obvious given that the enclosure is identified as Khasekhemwy's, but the specific character of the sealings adds important detail. The range of administrative offices represented, the specific titles used, the specific organizational terminology, all reflect an administrative system that was more developed and more systematically organized than what the earlier First Dynasty evidence shows. This administrative development is itself evidence for the specific institutional advance that Khasekhemwy's reign represented, not simply the building itself, but the specific administrative apparatus that managed the building, the scribes who recorded the resources, the officials who oversaw the labor, the specific organizational forms that coordinated the entire enterprise. This apparatus was more sophisticated in Khasekhemwy's time than in any previous reign. The specific administrative title that appears for the first time in the Khasekhemwy evidence, the title of vizier, the highest administrative office below the king, is one of the most important indicators of this institutional development. The vizier would become one of the most important officials in the Egyptian state throughout the subsequent 3,000 years of Egyptian history. The king's chief administrator, the person responsible for the day-to-day management of the state apparatus. The first evidence for this office comes from Khasekhemwy's reign. The first vizier, the first stone building chambers, the first systematic building program of the unified state's restored authority. The first dual name that incorporated both Horus and Seth. The specific accumulation of firsts in Khasekhemwy's reign is itself one of the most striking features of the period, and it is the accumulation that most directly supports the characterization of his reign as a genuine hinge point in the history of Egyptian civilization. He did not simply maintain, he innovated. He developed new administrative titles. He developed new building technologies. He developed new ideological formulations for the royal authority. He built at unprecedented scale. And all of these innovations, each one a specific contribution to the institutional and material infrastructure of the Egyptian state, were the specific foundation on which the Old Kingdom built its own extraordinary achievements. The connection between Khasekhemwy and the Old Kingdom is, in this light, one of the most direct and most significant connections in the entire history of Egyptian civilization. Not the connection of remote ancestry, not the kind of loose historical precedent that allows any era to claim any other as its inspiration. The specific, material, institutional connection of a civilization building directly on the specific foundations laid by a specific predecessor. The following sections examine those foundations in the specific physical and documentary evidence that the archaeological record has preserved. The specific religious dimension of the Second Dynasty crisis. The apparent conflict between the Horus tradition and the Seth tradition is one of the most fascinating and most debated aspects of this period, and it deserves careful attention because it shapes the understanding of what Khasekhemwy's dual name actually meant and why it was the specific solution he chose. In the Egyptian theological tradition, Horus and Seth were not simply different gods. They were the specific cosmic adversaries whose eternal conflict embodied the tension between order and chaos, between the inherited divine kingdom and the forces that threatened it, between the rightful heir and the usurper. The myth of Osiris, Horus, and Seth, in which Seth murders Osiris and claims the kingdom. Osiris's son Horus grows to avenge his father and reclaim the rightful inheritance, was one of the most fundamental narratives of the Egyptian theological tradition. It was the narrative that most directly expressed the specific character of the pharaonic ideology. The king as Horus, the living embodiment of the rightful divine order, defending the kingdom against the forces of chaos. This mythology was so deeply embedded in the pharaonic ideology that the appearance of a Seth name in the royal titulary was not simply a different religious preference. It was, in the specific symbolic language of the tradition, an assertion that the reigning king was Seth rather than Horus, the chaos power rather than the order power, the disruptor rather than the maintainer, whatever specific political reality lay behind this theological claim. Whether it reflected a genuine religious innovation, a faction that had a different theological tradition, or a specific symbolic strategy of a ruler who came to power under unusual circumstances, the theological implications were deeply disruptive to the specific cosmological order that the pharaonic ideology maintained. Khasekhemwy's solution to this disruption was theologically as well as politically sophisticated. By taking a name that incorporated both Horus and Seth, by declaring that both powers appear in him, he was not simply acknowledging the reality of the conflict. He was making a specific theological claim that the conflict between Horus and Seth had been resolved not by the victory of one over the other, but by their reconciliation within his own divine person. This reconciliation claim was a genuine theological innovation. The standard narrative of the Horus-Seth conflict ended with Horus's victory and Seth's defeat. The specific claim that Khasekhemwy was making, that both divine powers were reconciled and united within his own authority, was not the standard narrative. It was a new theological formulation, designed for the specific political circumstances of the reunification, that provided the most stable possible foundation for the restored unity. By refusing to declare any part of the reunified kingdom's population or traditions the defeated loser of the conflict. The sophistication of this theological innovation is not simply academic. In the specific conditions of a recently fractured kingdom, a theology that declared both traditions reconciled, rather than one triumphant, was genuinely more effective for long-term stability than a theology that declared one tradition victorious. The factional divisions that had produced the fracture were presumably still present in the population. The people who had aligned with the Seth tradition had not simply ceased to exist. A legitimacy claim that acknowledged their tradition and incorporated it, rather than declaring it defeated and illegitimate, was a legitimacy claim with a broader and more stable base. This is the political intelligence of a genuine statesman, operating through the specific medium of theological formulation, and it is political intelligence that deserves recognition as the specific civilizational achievement it represents. The following sections examine the physical monuments that expressed this political and theological achievement. The buildings that were its material form, the objects that were its documentary evidence, and the tomb that was its final institutional expression. The core problem: continuity after fracture, restoration after civil conflict, the specific challenge of rebuilding the institutional foundations of a civilization that had been disrupted at its deepest level, was not simply a political problem. It was a problem about meaning, about whether the specific claims that Egyptian civilization made about itself, about the divine nature of the king, about the cosmic order that the unified state maintained, about the legitimacy of the authority that extracted labor and tribute from the population, were claims that could survive the specific demonstration that they had proven insufficient to prevent the fracture Any civil conflict challenges the legitimacy claims of the state in this way. The fracture of the Second Dynasty was not simply a military or political event. It was a demonstration that the specific institutional arrangements of the unified Egyptian state had failed, that the specific legitimacy ideology had not been sufficient to prevent the fracture, whatever specific causes produced it. Restoring the state required not just the restoration of the political and military arrangements, but the restoration of the ideological claims, and the restoration of the ideological claims in a form that addressed the specific challenges the fracture had posed. Khasekhemwy addressed those challenges. His dual name and his military victory and his building program were all, in their different registers, responses to the specific ideological challenge of restoring the legitimacy claims of the unified Egyptian state after they had been publicly contested and partially negated by the Second Dynasty. Fracture. He restored them. More than that, he advanced them. The restored legitimacy claims were stronger, more institutionally developed, more architecturally impressive, more administratively sophisticated than what had existed before the fracture. The fracture had been, in a specific and important sense, a forcing function, the specific crisis that compelled the development of the ideological, administrative, and architectural innovations that the restored state required. This is the full depth of the core problem and the full scope of Khasekhemwy's solution to it. Now the account turns to the specific evidence, the buildings, the objects, the inscriptions, the tomb, through which that solution is most directly visible. The evidence is extraordinary, and it begins, as this account has consistently said, with the walls. With the walls at Abydos, still standing after 5,000 years. With the statues at Hierakonpolis, still bearing the carved figures of the defeated enemies. With the tomb under the desert surface, still containing the stone chambers that anticipated the pyramids. With the administrative sealings that show the first vizier, the first systematic record of a title that would persist for 3,000 years. And with the name itself, Khasekhemwy, the two powers appear, the hinge between the foundations and the pyramids. The pharaoh who stands at the beginning of everything that is most recognizable about the great period of ancient Egyptian civilization. Now the account examines the evidence in full. The examination is now underway. The specific evidence, the physical monuments, the administrative records, the statues, the architectural innovations, speaks for itself when assembled with the care that a century of specialist scholarship has made possible. What that evidence says about Khasekhemwy, about his reign and about his specific place in the history of Egyptian civilization is the subject of the extensive exploration that follows. The exploration begins with the site itself, with Hierakonpolis, the ancient city of the falcon god, where Quibel excavated and found the statues that are the most immediate physical evidence for the specific character of Khasekhemwy's political and military achievement. Hierakonpolis, the ancient city, the statues, the numbers carved in stone, more than 47,000 counted enemies, the specific beginning of the specific story. The story, in its full archaeological and historical detail, begins now. 5,000 years of silence, partially broken by Quibel's trenches in 1897, partially broken by Petrie at Abydos, partially broken by Dreyer and O'Connor and the Yale, Pennsylvania expedition, partially broken by the accumulated scholarly work of a century and more of dedicated specialist study, and now partially broken by this account. The core problem has been named, the solution has been sketched. The evidence follows. The evidence, examined carefully, tells one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of Egyptian archaeology. The story of a man who stood at the beginning of everything most recognizable about ancient Egyptian civilization and who has been almost entirely absent from the popular telling of that civilization story. The following sections give that story its full accounting. Beginning now. The statues of Khasekhemwy are in two places. One is in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. One is in the Ashmolean Museum of Art and Archaeology in Oxford, England. Both are seated royal figures, carved in limestone, approximately 50 centimeters high, showing a king in the formal seated posture of the pharaonic tradition. the posture that connects every representation of every pharaoh from the First Dynasty through the Ptolemaic period in a single, unbroken visual tradition of royal authority. And both have their carved bases, and both carry the carved enemy figures, and both carry beside those figures the numbers. The numbers are the most immediate evidence of the core problem and the core solution. They will be examined in detail in the following sections. But first, the site where they were found, and the man who found them, and what that moment of discovery tells us about the specific character of the evidence for Khasekhemwy's reign. Heracompolis in 1897, Quibel's trenches, the statues emerging from the desert, the numbers visible in the stone, the beginning of the modern scholarly understanding of the man who held the hinge between the foundations and the pyramids. That beginning is where Section 4 starts. Quibel's discovery, and everything that has been learned from Khasekhemwy's sites in the century since, gives us the most complete picture of the hinge point pharaoh that the evidence allows. That picture is what the explorations of Section 4 now reveal. 5,000 years of human achievement. One pharaoh at the hinge. The evidence, patient in the ground, waiting to be read. The reading begins now, in the chapters of exploration that follow. The core problem has been named. The full accounting of its solution awaits. The full accounting awaits in Section 4, and it is extraordinary. Chapter 1. Quibel at Heracompolis in 1897 CE. The British archaeologist James Quibel arrived at Heracompolis, the ancient city in Upper Egypt that the ancient Egyptians called Nekhen, the city of the falcon, the sacred origin point of the Horus kingship tradition that was the theological foundation of the pharaonic ideology. Quibel was excavating under the auspices of the Egypt Exploration Fund, the British organisation that had been sponsoring systematic excavation in Egypt since the 1880s, and he brought to the site the methodological approach that he had learned from Petrie. Systematic attention to context, careful recording of finds, the specific discipline of treating archaeological deposits as evidence, rather than simply as containers for interesting objects. What he found at Heracompolis transformed the scholarly understanding of the pre-Old Kingdom period. The site preserved, beneath the desert surface and within specific architectural deposits that had accumulated over centuries of occupation, material from the earliest phases of the Egyptian dynastic tradition in extraordinary quantity and quality. Pottery, stone vessels, carved objects, administrative ceilings, and the specific monumental objects. The Nama palette, the scorpion mace head, the two statues of Khasekhemwy, that became the most famous finds of the expedition and the most important surviving physical evidence for the early dynastic period. The specific deposit from which the Khasekhemwy statues were recovered was a specific archaeological context associated with what appears to have been an early temple precinct, a sacred space where votive objects and other materials associated with the royal cult had been deliberately deposited, in the way that Egyptian sacred sites regularly accumulated deliberately placed objects over centuries of use. The statues were not simply lost or abandoned. They were part of a specific deposit, in a specific sacred location that reflected the ongoing importance of the Heracompolis site as a center of royal religious activity across the early dynastic period. The statues themselves are seated royal figures. The pharaoh in the formal seated posture, the body contained and still in the way that Egyptian royal sculpture always contained and stilled the royal body, the face forward, the hands on the knees, the specific royal dignity of the pharaonic tradition expressed in the compact, permanent form that stone carving made possible. The limestone carving is, by the standards of the period, of good quality, not as refined as the finest work of the Old Kingdom, but competent and clearly intended as genuine royal portraiture, rather than simply formulaic representation. The bases are the extraordinary element. Carved with small incised figures of fallen enemies, men in the postures of defeat, their bodies arranged to fill the base surface, and beside the figures, the numbers, the specific numbers, more than 47,000 counted, twice, in two separate inscriptions on two separate statues, the same extraordinary figure appearing independently. Quibel recognized the significance of this immediately, whatever else they might represent. The numbers on the bases, were the most direct evidence available for the scale of the military conflict that Khasekhemwy had been involved in. The specific numerical record of a campaign whose outcome had been so significant that the king had chosen to commemorate it in the most permanent available medium, carved into the bases of statues placed in the most sacred available location. The scholarly analysis of what the numbers mean, what specifically was being counted, how the count was conducted, and what the resulting figure of more than 47,000 tells us about the scale of the Second Dynasty conflict, has continued since Quibel's discovery and has not reached a fully settled consensus. Different scholars have proposed different interpretations, that the numbers represent enemies killed in battle, that they represent prisoners taken, that they represent people processed in some administrative sense in the aftermath of the campaign, that they represent a symbolic rather than a literal count. The most widely held current view, based on the comparative analysis of similar inscriptions from the early dynastic period, is that the numbers represent something in the range of battle casualties or prisoners. The specific administrative accounting of a military campaign's outcome that the early Egyptian administrative tradition had developed the capacity to record, whether the numbers are precisely accurate or whether they reflect some degree of administrative rounding or propaganda enhancement, cannot be determined with certainty. What can be said is that numbers of this magnitude, in the range of 40,000 to 50,000 people, represented a military engagement of serious scale for the period, and that the specific character of the inscription, with its dual appearance on two independent monuments, gives it the specific quality of an official administrative record, rather than simply a symbolic boast. Chapter 2. The Shunet el-Zabib. The Shunet el-Zabib. The great mud brick enclosure at Abydos that is Khasekhemwy's most dramatically visible surviving monument has been visited, documented, partially excavated, and extensively studied for more than a century, and it remains the single most important physical evidence for the specific organizational capacity and the specific architectural ambitions of Khasekhemwy's reign. Standing at the edge of the desert behind the town of Abydos, the enclosure is immediately impressive, even in its current, partially decayed condition. The outer wall, built of large unfired mud brick, in the specific technique of alternating projections and recesses that constitutes the palace facade decoration, still stands to a height of nearly 10 meters in places. The enclosure measures approximately 122 meters by 64 meters in its external dimensions, an area equivalent to a substantial city block. The walls are between 4 and 5 meters thick at their base, tapering as they rise. The mud brick itself tells a story. Each brick is formed in a specific standard size that was maintained consistently across the full extent of the enclosure, the administrative imposition of a standard that required the coordination of all the brick-making operations supplying the construction. The laying patterns show the work of experienced bricklayers who understood the structural demands of large-scale mud brick construction and applied the specific techniques, the battered profiles, the layering patterns, the specific bonding conventions that distribute the structural loads across the wall section. David O'Connor of New York University, who led the Pennsylvania Yale Institute of Fine Arts expedition to Abydos from the 1970s through the 1990s, produced the most comprehensive modern analysis of the funerary enclosures at Abydos, including the Shunet el-Zabib. His work placed the enclosure in the context of a series of similar structures built by the First and early Second Dynasty rulers, demonstrating that Khasekhemwy's enclosure was both the culmination of this series and a significant advance on its predecessors in terms of scale, construction quality, and architectural sophistication. O'Connor's analysis also addressed the specific function of the enclosures, the question of what exactly these enormous structures were for, what activities took place within them, and how they related to the royal tombs at a distance of several kilometers to the southwest. His conclusion, which represents the current scholarly consensus, was that the enclosures were the mortuary temples of the royal funerary cult, the structures within which the rituals and ceremony associated with the dead king's ongoing divine existence performed by the priests of the mortuary establishment. This interpretation has specific implications for understanding what Khasekhemwy was building. The Shunet el-Zabib was not simply a prestige project or a demonstration of royal wealth. It was the institutional expression of the specific theological understanding of royal death that the pharaonic ideology maintained. The understanding that the king's death was a transformation into divine existence, that the divine existence required ongoing ritual maintenance, and that the maintenance required a specific architectural setting of appropriate scale and quality. The scale of the Shunet el-Zabib was therefore a statement not simply about Khasekhemwy's wealth or organizational capacity, but about the specific theological importance of the royal mortuary cult, about the cosmic significance of the king's divine existence after death, and the institutional seriousness with which the state was organized to sustain that existence through ritual performance. This theological statement, made in mud brick on the scale of a small stadium, was one of the most powerful legitimacy demonstrations that the reunified state produced in Khasekhemwy's reign, in a kingdom that had just emerged from a fracture, whose immediate cause was a conflict over the theological political identity of the royal tradition. The construction of the largest and most sophisticated mortuary enclosure in Egyptian history was a specific assertion of the restored and enhanced authority of the traditional Horus-based divine kingship. Whatever had happened in the Second Dynasty, whatever conflicts had disrupted the institutional continuity of the state, the king who built the Shunet el-Zabib was demonstrating that the traditional divine kingship was not only restored, but more powerfully and more institutionally deeply expressed than at any previous moment in the tradition's history. Chapter 3. The tomb at Abydos. Khasekhemwy's tomb, designated Tomb V in the scholarly literature of the Abydos Royal Cemetery, is the largest of all the early royal tombs at the site, and, in several specific architectural features, the most technically sophisticated of the pre-Old Kingdom royal burials. The tomb occupies a position in the royal necropolis at Abydos, to the southwest of the funerary enclosures, in the portion of the desert plateau, where all the First and Second Dynasty royal tombs were concentrated. Its external dimensions are significantly larger than any of the First Dynasty tombs. The tomb is approximately 69 meters long by 10 meters wide in its internal measurements, a scale that dwarfs even the most elaborate of Den's or Ka's burials. Its internal organization reflects a specific development in the architectural complexity of the royal tomb, rather than the single-chamber or multi-chamber arrangements of the First Dynasty burials. Khasekhemwy's tomb has a more complex internal structure with multiple rooms and a specific arrangement that anticipates the architectural organization of the later pyramid complexes. The most technically significant feature of the tomb is the use of stone in the central burial chambers. Several of the chambers in the central portion of the tomb are constructed with stone-built walls and stone-capped roofs. The first systematic use of stone in a structural capacity in the history of Egyptian royal tomb construction. The stone used was limestone, quarried from the desert limestone deposits that were the primary building material of the Old Kingdom's great monuments. The specific character of the stone construction in Khasekhemwy's tomb, the scale of the chambers, the quality of the stone dressing, the specific structural techniques employed, reveals a workforce with genuine stoneworking skill. This was not an improvised or experimental application of a new material. It was the work of craftsmen who understood the structural properties of cut limestone and who could apply that understanding to the specific requirements of a large underground burial chamber. Where did these craftsmen come from? This is a question that the evidence cannot answer directly, but the most plausible answer is that they were the product of a craft tradition that had been developing in Egypt since at least the beginning of the First Dynasty. A tradition that had worked with limestone in architectural detailing and in the production of stone vessels, and that had been developing across the First and Second Dynasties the specific skills and techniques that the systematic structural use of stone required. The existence of this craft tradition and its deployment in the stone chambers of Khasekhemwy's tomb is itself one of the most important pieces of evidence for understanding the transition to the Old Kingdom. The specific technical knowledge that Imhotep and his colleagues would deploy in building the step pyramid was not created from nothing. It was developed over generations by craftsmen who had been working with stone in increasingly demanding architectural contexts. Khasekhemwy's tomb was the most demanding context yet, and the craftsmen who built its stone chambers were the institutional ancestors of the pyramid builders. Chapter 4. The objects and their significance the tomb at Abydos and the Heracompolis deposits have between them produced a remarkable collection of objects associated with Khasekhemwy's reign, objects that illuminate the specific character of the court culture, the administrative practices, and the material culture of the period in ways that supplement the architectural evidence. The stone vessels are particularly important. Khasekhemwy's reign was associated with the production of stone vessels in large quantities. The specific Egyptian craft of producing bowls, jars, vases, and other forms in a range of stones including alabaster, basalt, limestone, and granite. This craft had been developing since the pre-dynastic period, but it reached a specific peak of production in the First and Second Dynasties. The stone vessels from Khasekhemwy's context show both the quantitative scale of production. Thousands of vessels were produced in association with the royal funerary program, and the qualitative sophistication of the craft at this period. The importance of the stone vessels goes beyond their intrinsic value as objects. They were, in the specific economic and administrative context of the early Egyptian state, one of the primary forms of institutional storage and the primary medium of high-status exchange within the royal economy. The vessels that bore the king's name or seal were not simply containers. They were pieces of the royal administrative system, objects that marked their contents as part of the royal economy, and that circulated through the administrative networks of the state as markers of royal authority. The administrative sealings, the impressions left by cylinder seals pressed into clay closures applied to containers, doors, and other sealed objects, are among the most important documentary sources for the administrative practices of Khasekhemwy's reign. The sealings show the range of administrative offices and the range of activities that the royal administrative apparatus was engaged in, the specific categories of goods being tracked, the specific officials responsible for different administrative functions, and the specific organizational conventions that govern the administrative system. The appearance of the vizier's seal in the Khasekhemwy sealings, as noted in the previous section, is the most historically significant single piece of documentary evidence from the period. The vizier, the title that in Egyptian was Imir, something like overseer of the great house, was the highest administrative office below the king, the official responsible for the day-to-day management of the state apparatus. The title appears for the first time in the Khasekhemwy evidence, and its appearance is one of the specific indicators that the administrative development of his reign reached a threshold of complexity that required a new level of institutional organization. The vizier's office would persist for 3,000 years. The specific title, with its specific responsibilities and its specific institutional position at the apex of the administrative hierarchy, would be carried by officials across the entire subsequent history of the Egyptian state, from the Old Kingdom through the New Kingdom through the Ptolemaic period. And the first holder of the title appears in the fragmentary documentary evidence of the early dynastic period in the context of Khasekhemwy's administration. This is the specific scale of the administrative innovation that his reign represents. The vizier, the most important administrative office in the history of ancient Egypt after the king himself, first attested in the reign of Khasekhemwy. Chapter 5. Khasekhemwy and the transition to the Old Kingdom. The specific question of the relationship between Khasekhemwy and the founder of the Third Dynasty, the Pharaoh Djoser, in whose reign Imhotep designed the step pyramid, is one of the most fascinating questions in the study of the early period, and one whose answer reveals the specific institutional character of the transition from the Second Dynasty to the Old Kingdom. The evidence suggests a direct familial connection between Khasekhemwy and Djoser, an ivory vessel fragment found in association with Djoser's step pyramid complex bears the name of Nimarthap, who is identified as the mother of the king's children, apparently the mother of Djoser's predecessor or of Djoser himself. Nimarthap also appears in evidence associated with the end of Khasekhemwy's reign, and the scholarly consensus is that she was Khasekhemwy's wife and the mother of Djoser. If this identification is correct, and the evidence for it, while not entirely conclusive, is compelling, then Djoser was Khasekhemwy's son, and the Third Dynasty was founded not by a new ruling family, but by the continuation of Khasekhemwy's own line. The transition from the Second Dynasty to the Third Dynasty was, in this reading, not a dynastic change, but a dynastic continuation, the son inheriting the kingdom that the father had reunified and built. This specific connection, if it is real, has profound implications for understanding the relationship between Khasekhemwy's achievements and the Old Kingdoms. The institutional and material inheritance that the pyramid builders drew on was not the inheritance of a remotely related predecessor. It was the direct inheritance of a son from a father, the specific organizational capacity, the building traditions, the administrative apparatus, the skilled craftsmen, passed within a single family, maintained and developed by the son, who had grown up within the institutional world that the father had created. The mathematics of this connection are, in a specific sense, striking. Khasekhemwy built the first stone burial chambers. His son, if the identification is correct, built the first stone building above ground. The specific material and craft knowledge required for both achievements was the same knowledge, applied at different scales and in different architectural contexts. The connection is not simply temporal or familial, it is the specific, concrete, institutional connection of a craft tradition passed within a specific building program across a single generation. The Step Pyramid of Djoser is one of the most recognized monuments in the world. It is the first pyramid, the first large-scale stone building, one of the founding monuments of everything that would subsequently be called Egyptian civilization. And it was built by a man who was, if the scholarly consensus is correct, the son of Khasekhemwy. The hinge point was not simply between two dynasties, it was between a father and a son, and the son built the first pyramid. Chapter 6. The Scale of What Was Lost. The specific character of the Second Dynasty crisis, the fracture that Khasekhemwy was called to heal, is difficult to assess precisely because the evidence for it is precisely the kind of evidence that a successfully reunified kingdom would have had reason to downplay or suppress. The evidence of the conflict itself, the records of the Seth-associated rulers, the material culture associated with the factional period. The Egyptian state, from its earliest phases, had a specific institutional practice of managing the memory of disrupted periods, the erasure of names, the defacement of images, the deliberate non-recording of reigns that had been retrospectively delegitimized. This practice, visible most dramatically in the later deliberate erasure of Hatshepsut's monuments under Thutmose III and in the obliteration of Akhenaten's name in the New Kingdom, appears to have been active in the early period as well. The evidence for the Second Dynasty conflict is fragmentary in part, because a successfully reunified state had institutional reasons to reduce the visibility of the conflict once it was resolved. This means that the scale of what was actually disrupted, the depth of the institutional damage, the geographic extent of the conflict, the specific duration of the period of division, is genuinely uncertain and possibly significantly larger than the surviving evidence directly indicates. What we can say is that the reunification that Khasekhemwy accomplished was significant enough to be commemorated in the most dramatic and permanent way available to the early dynastic tradition. The carved enemy figures on the statue bases, with their extraordinary numbers, placed in the most sacred available location, the commemoration implies that the conflict being resolved was genuinely serious, that the achievement of reunification was sufficiently important to require the most emphatic available institutional acknowledgement, and the specific building program that followed the reunification implies that the institutional resources of the restored unified state were substantial, that the organizational capacity Khasekhemwy deployed in the construction of the Shunet el-Zabib and the tomb at Abydos and the other structures of his reign was the organizational capacity of a genuinely restored, genuinely functioning, genuinely powerful unified kingdom. The conflict was serious, the restoration was genuine, and the proof of the restoration was in the building, in the walls that are still standing 5,000 years later, in the stone chambers that anticipated the pyramids, in the administrative records that show the first vizier and the most developed organizational apparatus the early period had produced. That is the full scale of what Khasekhemwy achieved, and that scale, the depth of the crisis he resolved and the height of the achievement he produced, is the specific measure of his historical significance. Chapter 7. The Living Tradition at Abydos. The site of Abydos, as noted throughout this series, has been continuously sacred for more than 5,000 years. The earliest royal tombs established it as the burial ground of the divine kings. The funerary enclosures of the early dynastic period established it as the location of the royal mortuary cult. The Middle Kingdom establishment of the Osiris cult at Abydos connected the site to the most important of all Egyptian theological traditions, making it the center of pilgrimage and the destination of the most important annual religious celebrations in the Egyptian calendar. The later temples, built by Seti I and Ramesses II, made it a site of extraordinary architectural importance throughout the New Kingdom. This continuous sacred tradition at Abydos means that the specific remains of Khasekhemwy's reign at the site were not simply buried in the desert and forgotten. They were incorporated into a living sacred landscape that maintained their presence, if not their specific identity, across the subsequent history of the site. The Shunet El Zabib was still standing in the New Kingdom. Medieval travellers mentioned it. The local population gave it its name, the Raisin House, and it was still known as a significant ancient monument in the modern era, when Petrie and his successors began systematic excavation. The continuity of the sacred landscape at Abydos is itself one of the most extraordinary features of Egyptian civilization's specific relationship to its own past. Sites that had been sacred in the earliest period of the tradition maintained their sacred character across 3,000 years of subsequent history, not because there was a simple institutional continuity from the earliest priests to the latest, but because the Egyptian theological tradition systematically incorporated the oldest available sacred sites into its own developing framework, treating antiquity itself as a form of sacred authority. This incorporation of the old by the new is itself one of the most powerful features of the Egyptian institutional tradition, and one of the clearest expressions of its specific character. The Archazing's programs described throughout this series, the Seti period reaching back to Old Kingdom forms, the New Kingdom pharaohs adding to the temples of their predecessors, the continuous maintenance of the ancient royal cults, were all expressions of the same underlying principle, that the accumulated authority of a long sacred tradition was more powerful than the authority of any single moment, and that incorporating the old was more effective than replacing it. Khasekhemwy built at Abydos and at Heracompolis. Both sites remained sacred for the next 3,000 years. His structures became part of the accumulated authority of those sites, not as identifiably Khasekhemwy's structures, since most visitors in the subsequent 3,000 years almost certainly did not know his name, but as the specific evidence of the site's antiquity and its continuous sacredness. The Shunet El Zabib, standing in the desert behind Abydos across 3,000 years of Egyptian history, was itself a demonstration of the specific principle that made Egyptian civilization so durable, the accumulation of sacred authority through the maintenance and respect for the oldest available forms. It was an early expression of the same principle that the Site Archaizing program expressed more than 2,000 years later, and it was built by Khasekhemwy, who stood at the beginning of the tradition that it expressed. Chapter 8. The Stone Vessels and Administrative Sealings. Among the most abundant and most informative categories of material evidence from Khasekhemwy's reign are the stone vessels, the bowls, jars, and containers produced in alabaster, basalt, limestone, breccia, and granite by the specialized craftsmen of the royal workshops. Thousands of such vessels were deposited in the early royal tombs and the funerary enclosures, and the Khasekhemwy context is among the richest in terms of both quantity and variety. The stone vessel tradition was one of the most characteristic expressions of the Egyptian court's material culture in the early dynastic period. In an era before glass, before fine ceramics of the kind that later periods would produce, and in a region where high-quality stone was accessible through the quarrying operations the state had developed, stone vessels represented the highest category of container, the containers associated with the most valuable substances and the most important ritual contexts. The specific stones used carried specific symbolic associations. Alabaster for the sacred oils and liquids of the royal ritual, granite and basalt for their hardness and permanence, the various decorative stones for their distinctive visual qualities, the technical skill required to produce these vessels, to hollow out a piece of granite or basalt, working with stone tools and abrasive powders, creating a thin-walled container with a smooth interior, was the product of generations of craft development. The craftsmen who produced the vessels in Khasekhemwy's workshops were the inheritors of a tradition that reached back to the pre-dynastic period, and they were, by the evidence of the objects they produced, among the most technically skilled stone workers in the ancient world. This craft skill was one of the specific institutional inheritances that Khasekhemwy's reign would pass to the Old Kingdom. The same craftsman who could hollow out a granite bowl could quarry and dress a granite block. The same understanding of the material properties of limestone that allowed the production of thin-walled limestone vessels was the understanding that informed the structural use of limestone in the step pyramid. The stone vessel tradition and the stone building tradition were not separate craft worlds. They were different applications of the same fundamental craft knowledge. Understanding this connection, understanding that the sophisticated stone vessel production of the early dynastic period was part of the same craft trajectory that led to the pyramids, is one of the specific insights that the careful study of Khasekhemwy's material culture provides. The administrative ceilings from the Shunet el-Zgibib and the tomb at Abydos add a different dimension to the picture. The documentary evidence for the organizational apparatus that managed the construction projects, the royal estates, and the broader administrative life of the reunified state. The ceilings are small objects, clay impressions, a few centimeters across, but they carry a remarkable amount of information in their tiny incised designs. The name of the king, identifiable by the sarek. The name of the official whose seal it was, identifiable by the specific design elements. The specific administrative contexts. The type of commodity being sealed. The specific office responsible, visible in the associated inscriptions. The range of administrative titles in the Khasekhemwy ceilings is broader than in any earlier reign's documentary evidence. Beyond the vizier, the ceilings show a developed hierarchy of administrative offices, overseers of specific royal estates, officials responsible for specific categories of royal tribute, specialists in the management of specific commodities. The organizational structure visible in the ceilings is that of a genuinely complex administrative apparatus, an apparatus capable of managing the multidimensional logistics of a large-scale state economy. This organizational complexity is the specific institutional expression of the reunified state's capacity. Khasekhemwy had not simply restored the unity of the kingdom. He had developed its administrative infrastructure to a level that his predecessors, even the First Dynasty rulers, whose specific achievements are described elsewhere in this series, had not matched. Chapter 9. The wider world, the Egyptian state under Khasekhemwy, did not exist in isolation. The specific character of its external relationships, with the peoples of the Sinai, with the Levantine coast, with the communities of the eastern and western deserts, shaped both the resources available to the king's building program and the specific character of the military and diplomatic activities associated with his reign. The Sinai was the most important external resource zone for the early Egyptian state. The copper deposits of the Sinai and the turquoise deposits of the same region had been exploited by Egyptian expeditions since at least the First Dynasty, and the specific administrative capacity required to organize and protect those expeditions was one of the ongoing concerns of the early dynastic state. The inscriptions at Wadi Magara in the Sinai, the earliest Egyptian rock inscriptions outside of the Nile Valley, include material that has been associated with Khasekhemwy's reign, providing evidence that the Egyptian state's interest in the Sinai mineral resources continued under his administration. The Levantine coast was important for different reasons. The wood, the cedar, and other Levantine timbers that were essential for large-scale construction in a country largely lacking in native construction quality wood. That the early Egyptian building programs required came primarily from the Levantine forests. The specific commercial and diplomatic relationships that gave Egypt access to this resource were among the most important external relationships of the early state, and their maintenance required specific attention in the diplomatic and commercial activities of the royal administration. The specific evidence for Khasekhemwy's engagement with the Levant is limited. The documentary record of the early period, how it rarely preserves the details of specific diplomatic or commercial transactions, but the building program itself is evidence of the external relationships it required. The timber roofing elements of the Shunet el-Zabib came from somewhere, and the most likely source was Levantine imports. The specific organizational capacity that managed those imports was part of the broader administrative apparatus of Khasekhemwy's administration. The communities of the Eastern Desert, the pastoral and semi-nomadic groups who occupied the territory between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea coast, were a continuous presence in the borderland of the Egyptian state, and the management of the relationship with these communities was one of the recurring concerns of the early Egyptian administration. The evidence for military activities against desert peoples in the Khasekhemwy context is consistent with the broader pattern of the early period in which the Egyptian state's eastern frontier required ongoing attention. Chapter 10. The transition and its institutional significance. The transition from Khasekhemwy's reign to the Third Dynasty is, as argued throughout this account, one of the most institutionally significant transitions in the history of Egyptian civilization, not because it represented a sharp discontinuity. The evidence suggests, rather, the opposite, but because it represented the specific institutional threshold at which the accumulated organizational capacity of the early period became sufficient for the specific achievements that defined the Old Kingdom. The threshold concept is important here. Institutional development does not produce its most dramatic consequences gradually and proportionally. Organizations and traditions and states develop capacity across many years and many small incremental advances, and then at specific threshold moments, when the accumulated capacity exceeds some critical level, the visible output changes dramatically. The step pyramid was not simply a bigger version of Khasekhemwy's buildings. It was a qualitatively different kind of achievement, representing the deployment of stone architecture at a scale and in a systematic way that no previous builder had approached. But the step to the step pyramid was enabled by the specific accumulated capacity of the period that preceded it. The craftsmen, the administrative apparatus, the organizational knowledge, the building traditions. All of these were the specific inheritance that Khasekhemwy's reign contributed to the institutional treasury from which the Old Kingdom drew. The specific mechanism by which this inheritance was transmitted is visible in the familial connection. If Djoser was indeed Khasekhemwy's son, the transmission was literal, the son inheriting the organizational apparatus, the craftsman's community, the administrative officials, and the building traditions that his father had assembled and developed. The institutional treasury was passed whole, from father to son, across the dynasty change. This is the specific institutional reality that makes Khasekhemwy more than an interesting figure in the history of the Second Dynasty. He is the specific individual, the specific ruler, with the specific organizational achievements, whose reign created the conditions within which the pyramids became possible. He is the hinge, and the hinge was real. The Shunet el-Zabib is still standing. The stone chambers of his tomb are still there, under the desert. The administrative ceilings are in museum collections. The statues are in Cairo and Oxford, their bases still carrying the numbers. The evidence is in the ground and in the museums. And the evidence, assembled carefully, tells one of the most important untold stories in the history of the ancient world. The last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty was the first pharaoh of the world that built the pyramids. That is the full scale of his significance, and it has been, for too long, almost entirely invisible. Chapter 11. The monuments in their museums, the two statues of Khasekhemwy, have had their own remarkable journey through time, a journey that is itself one of the more extraordinary stories of ancient objects in the modern world. The statue now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo was transferred there after Quibel's excavation, following the standard practice of the period by which significant Egyptian archaeological finds were divided between the excavating institution and the Egyptian National Collection. It is displayed in the Old Kingdom galleries, in the context of other early dynastic and Old Kingdom material, where it is regularly encountered by visitors who are working their way through the most comprehensive collection of early Egyptian material in the world. The statue in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford has a different institutional home, one that reflects the specific character of late 19th century Egyptian archaeology, when British institutional and individual collectors regularly acquired significant Egyptian antiquities through excavation, purchase, and donation. The Ashmolean's Khasekhemwy statue is one of the most important objects in that museum's collection, and it is displayed with the specific information about its excavation context and its historical significance that modern museum presentation standards require. Both statues are, by any reasonable assessment, among the most important surviving objects from the entire early dynastic period. They are not simply the first well-preserved examples of seated royal sculpture from the period, though they are that. They are the specific objects that carry, in their carved bases, the most direct evidence available for the military dimension of Khasekhemwy's career. They are the objects that combine, in a single physical thing, the aesthetic tradition of royal portraiture and the administrative tradition of military commemoration. The specific integration of the symbolic and the practical that characterized the Egyptian court's approach to the material expression of royal authority. Looking at these statues, whether in person in Cairo or Oxford, or in the high-resolution photographs that museum collections now make available online, is one of the most direct available experiences of the specific historical moment this account has been, describing the formal face, forward-looking, carrying the specific dignity of the royal tradition, the hands on the knees, the body contained and still in the way that stone still makes it permanent, the base carved with fallen men and the numbers that count them, 5,000 years compressed into two limestone figures, sitting in their museum cases, carrying the specific evidence of a specific achievement that deserves to be as famous as the pyramids that the achievement made possible. The statues have been waiting for the full accounting of what they represent. This account has attempted to provide it. The implications and the closing follow. Chapter 12. What comes after the reign of Djoser, Khasekhemwy's apparent son, the first king of the Third Dynasty, the ruler who commissioned the Step Pyramid, is, from the perspective of this account, the specific evidence that Khasekhemwy's achievements were genuinely foundational rather than simply impressive for their period. The Step Pyramid complex at Saqqara is not simply the first pyramid. It is a complete architectural revolution, the systematic application of stone construction to the full range of royal funerary architecture, creating a complex of buildings whose scale, sophistication, and ambition had no predecessor in the history of the ancient world. The pyramid itself, rising in 6 steps to a height of approximately 60 meters, was the tallest structure in the world when it was built. The surrounding complex of courts, subsidiary buildings, and enclosure wall represented the full elaboration of the royal funerary ideology in stone architecture at a scale that no previous ruler had approached. The specific individual credited with designing this revolution is Imhotep, the architect, physician, and sage who was later deified, who appears in the ancient sources as the greatest intellectual figure of the early period and whose name is the first name of an individual craftsman or architect in the history of the ancient world that has been transmitted to posterity. Imhotep is the first named architect. The Step Pyramid is the first pyramid, and both achievements were made possible in the specific institutional sense this account has been describing by the organizational capacity and the building traditions that Khasekhemwy assembled. Imhotep did not build the Step Pyramid from nothing. He built it from the accumulated craft knowledge, the organizational experience, and the building traditions of the period that preceded him, the period that culminated in Khasekhemwy's reign. He was the specific genius who synthesized those traditions into a revolutionary new form. But the materials of the synthesis, the craft knowledge, the organizational capacity, the accumulated experience of working at large scale were Khasekhemwy's legacy. The hinge did not simply open a door. It opened a door to the most extraordinary architectural tradition in the history of the ancient world. And the pharaoh who held the hinge, who stood at the opening and made the door possible, was the last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty, Khasekhemwy. His name means the two powers appear, the two powers of Horus and Seth, reconciled in his own authority, the two powers of the fractured kingdom, reunified under his rule, the two powers of the early period's foundations and the old kingdom's ambitions, brought together in the specific institutional and material achievements of his reign. The two powers appear in the Shunet el-Zibib, still standing, in the stone chambers of the tomb at Abydos, in the administrative ceilings that show the first vizier, in the statues at Cairo and Oxford, their bases carrying the numbers, in the step pyramid that his son built, in the pyramids at Giza that followed. The two powers appear, and Khasekhemwy was the pharaoh through whom they appeared. The account of the pharaoh who held the hinge is now complete in its exploratory dimension. The implications and the reflection follow, drawing out the broader significance of what the evidence reveals. And then the closing, the final accounting that gives Khasekhemwy the recognition that the evidence demands and that the silence around his name has too long withheld. The recognition begins now. The deeper truth about Khasekhemwy is not the truth about the Second Dynasty, or the truth about the transition to the Old Kingdom, or even the truth about the specific architectural and administrative achievements of his reign. Those are important truths. But the deeper truth runs beneath all of them, and it is this. The most consequential figures in the history of civilization are almost always the people who work at the hinges, who stand at the specific moments when one great period ends and another begins, who do the specific work of restoration and consolidation and institutional building that makes the next great period possible, and who receive none of the recognition that the next great period generates for its more visible achievements. The pyramids are visible from orbit. The Step Pyramid can be seen from the outskirts of modern Cairo. The administrative innovations of Khasekhemwy's reign are visible only to the specialist who knows how to read the evidence. The Shunet el-Zabib stands in the desert behind Abydos, impressive to those who seek it out, almost unknown to the wider world. The statues in Cairo and Oxford carry their numbers quietly in their museum cases. The pattern is as consistent as it is unjust. The builders of foundations are invisible. The builders of monuments on those foundations are famous. The pyramids are monuments. Khasekhemwy is a foundation. But the deeper truth requires looking at this pattern more carefully, because the specific character of what Khasekhemwy built reveals something important about what foundation building actually involves and why it is harder in specific and important ways than monument building. Monument building requires organizational capacity and resources and a specific vision of what should be built. It also helps to have an intact institutional foundation on which to build. Djoser and Imhotep had all of these. The organizational capacity that Khasekhemwy had developed, the craft traditions that the early period had accumulated, the administrative apparatus that the first vizier's office represented, and the political stability that the reunification had restored. Foundation building under crisis conditions requires something more and something different. It requires the specific combination of military effectiveness and ideological creativity and institutional intelligence that Khasekhemwy demonstrated. The ability to win the conflict, to formulate a legitimacy claim that could encompass the full range of the divided kingdom's traditions, and to deploy the organizational capacity of the restored state toward the specific institutional projects that would make the restoration permanent. This combination, military, ideological, and institutional simultaneously, is extraordinarily rare. Most rulers who are capable of winning the military conflict are not also capable of the ideological creativity required for genuine reconciliation. Most who are capable of ideological creativity are not also capable of the organizational deployment of the restored state's resources toward the institutional building that makes the restoration permanent. The combination of all three in a single reign and the specific achievement of deploying all three simultaneously is a rarity in the history of any civilization. Khasekhemwy achieved it. The evidence is in the Shunet el-Zabib and the tomb at Abydos, and the administrative ceilings and the statues with their numbers and the dual name that proclaim the reconciliation of both powers. The evidence is in the specific institutional inheritance that Joseph received and deployed in building the step pyramid. The evidence is in the continuous sacred tradition at Abydos that the Shunet el-Zabib anchored for 3,000 years of subsequent Egyptian history. The deeper truth is that Khasekhemwy built the conditions within which everything most recognizable about ancient Egyptian civilizations became possible. The pyramids, the Old Kingdom's administrative sophistication. The specific institutional forms that sustained the civilization for 3,000 years. All of this was made possible, in a specific and traceable institutional sense, by the specific achievements of a ruler who stood at the hinge and held it. This truth has been invisible for most of the 5,000 years since he ruled. It is invisible in part because the evidence for his reign is difficult to read. It requires specialist knowledge, careful archaeological analysis, and the patient accumulation of comparative evidence that only decades of systematic scholarship can produce. It is invisible in part because his name is difficult to pronounce, and his titles are arcane, and his monuments are in a state of archaeological preservation that requires effort to appreciate. And it is invisible in part because the monuments that came after him, the Step Pyramid, the Giza Pyramids, the New Kingdom temples, are so visually overwhelming that they naturally draw all the attention, leaving in their shadow the specific ruler who made them possible. The invisibility is understandable, it is not excusable. Khasekhemwy deserves to be known, not as a footnote to the pyramid builders, not as the obscure last pharaoh of a poorly understood dynasty, as the specific individual who stood at the most important hinge point between the early period and the Old Kingdom, who did the specific work that the hinge required, and who left behind the specific institutional and material inheritance that the pyramid builders drew on. The deeper truth about the civilization that built the pyramids is that the pyramids were built by people who inherited specific organizational capacity, specific craft traditions, and specific institutional forms from specific predecessors. The pyramids were not built from nothing. They were built from the accumulated work of the early period, and the most important single contribution of the early period to that accumulation was Khasekhemwy's reunification and building program. That is the deeper truth, and it deserves the recognition that this account has been working to provide. There is one more dimension of the deeper truth that belongs here, and it concerns the specific relationship between this account and the series it belongs to. This series has traced the story of Egyptian civilization from Den's founding moment in the First Dynasty, through the late period pharaohs and the Ptolemaic synthesis, to the crisis of the Rosetta Stone. Each account has been examining a specific individual at a specific moment in the 5,000-year arc of the tradition, looking for the specific human intelligence and the specific historical circumstances that produced the specific achievements that define the moment. Khasekhemwy belongs in this series not simply because he is an interesting figure from an underexplored period. He belongs in it because his specific reign embodies, more clearly than almost any other moment in the arc, the specific pattern that the series has been tracing throughout, the pattern of civilizational continuity maintained through individual institutional intelligence, of foundations built by people who did not live to see the monuments built on them, of the deep tradition sustained by the specific intelligence of specific people at specific critical moments. The series began with Den, at the beginning of the tradition. It has examined many of the most important moments in the tradition's long arc, and now, in this account of Khasekhemwy, it has examined the specific moment when the early tradition's accumulated achievements were gathered up and synthesized into the institutional foundation of the most famous phase of Egyptian civilization. The gathering and the synthesis were Khasekhemwy's work. The most famous phase was built by his son, and the specific connection between the gatherer and the builder, the father who reunified the kingdom and accumulated the institutional capacity, and the son who built the first pyramid, is the single most direct and most important connection in the entire 5,000-year arc of the tradition this series has been tracing. Den at the beginning, Khasekhemwy at the hinge, the pyramids at the apex, all of them part of the same story. The story of a specific civilizational tradition, sustained by specific individuals at specific critical moments, producing the most extraordinary continuous achievement in the history of the ancient world. Khasekhemwy's place in that story is clear. It has been clear to the specialists for decades. It deserves to be clear to the wider world. Now, through this account, it can be. There is a grief in the story of Khasekhemwy that this section must name honestly, because the grief is part of the truth, and the truth deserves its full acknowledgement. The grief is the grief of the hinge figure, the specific grief of the person who does the essential preparatory work and then is forgotten in favor of those who build on it. Khasekhemwy reunified the kingdom. His son built the first pyramid. History remembers the first pyramid. It does not remember the reunification that made it possible. Imhotep's name has survived 5,000 years as the first named architect in history, celebrated across the ages for the revolutionary achievement of the step pyramid. Khasekhemwy's name is known only to specialists. This is not simply the way things happen in history. It is the specific and recurrent pattern of the hinge figure's invisibility, the pattern that this series has been tracing throughout, in different forms and different periods. Psamtik I rebuilt the institutional foundations of the Second Dynasty. His successors built the commercial empire. Ptolemy I founded the library. His son built it to its greatest scope. The founders and the consolidators and the restorers are consistently less visible than the builders who come after them. Khasekhemwy is the most extreme version of this pattern in the entire series. He stands not just one generation before the most visible achievement. He stands one generation before the entire pyramid tradition, the architectural program that has been one of the most visible and most celebrated features of Egyptian civilization for 5,000 years. The shadow cast by the pyramids over everything that precedes them is larger and darker than any other shadow in the history of the ancient world. And in that shadow, Khasekhemwy waits. The grief is also about the specific nature of the civil conflict that preceded his reign. The conflict that is mostly invisible in the historical record, but that clearly caused genuine damage to the institutional fabric of the early Egyptian state. The people who died in whatever fighting the Second Dynasty fracture produced are not numbered and commemorated in the way that the 47,000 figures on Khasekhemwy statue bases commemorate a specific military campaign. They are simply absent from the record, lost in the institutional damage of a period that the successful reunification subsequently had reason to minimize. Every successful reunification of a fractured state leaves this kind of invisible grief. The damage that was done before the restoration, the institutional knowledge that was lost during the fracture, the people whose lives were disrupted or ended by the conflict. None of this is visible in the surviving evidence for Khasekhemwy's reign, which naturally emphasizes the achievement of the reunification rather than the cost of the preceding fracture. But the cost was real. The fractured kingdom was real. The people who aligned with the Seth tradition or the Horus tradition, who took sides in whatever specific conflict the Second Dynasty produced, who found themselves on the wrong side of the reunification or the right side, their lives were shaped by the specific crisis that Khasekhemwy resolved. Their specific experiences are lost to history, in the way that the experiences of ordinary people in ancient conflicts are almost always lost. The grief is also personal, in the sense that any attempt to reconstruct a human being from 5,000-year-old archaeological evidence is always shadowed by the recognition of how much is permanently lost. We know Khasekhemwy's name. We know, approximately, when he ruled. We know the specific achievements of his reign from the physical evidence they left behind. We know his name meant the two powers appear, and that this name carried the specific political theological meaning of the reunification. We know the number carved on his statue bases. We do not know his face except in the idealized royal portraiture of the statues. We do not know his age at accession or at death. We do not know how he experienced the specific challenge of the civil conflict and the reunification, whether with confidence or with uncertainty, with grief or with determination, or with the specific combination of qualities that the achievement required. We do not know how he understood his own historical significance, whether he had any sense that the institutional foundation he was building would sustain 3,000 years of subsequent Egyptian civilization, or whether his ambitions were entirely focused on the specific challenges of his specific moment. The evidence does not allow those questions to be answered. The 5,000 years of time and desert and the specific conditions of the early period's fragmentary record have taken those possibilities permanently out of reach. What remains is the evidence, the stones and the clay and the numbers and the name. But the evidence is enough to tell the story. And the story, told honestly, in the full context that the best available scholarship provides, is one of the most important untold stories in the history of the ancient world. The last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty was the first pharaoh of the world that built the pyramids. The specific human being who stood at that hinge, who did the specific work that the hinge required, who left behind the specific institutional and material inheritance that made the most famous phase of Egyptian civilization possible. That person deserves to be known. His name was Khasekhemwy. The two powers appear. Now you know why that mattered. The implications and the closing follow. The specific connection between the grief of the hinge figure and the broader theme of this series deserves one more paragraph's attention, because it is the theme that connects Den's account and Khasekhemwy's account and the late period pharaoh's accounts into a single coherent argument about the nature of civilizational continuity. The continuity of Egyptian civilization across 5,000 years was not produced by inevitable historical forces or by the natural tendency of a river valley civilization to persist. It was produced by specific human beings doing specific institutional work at specific critical moments, moments when the tradition was most at risk, and when the specific intelligence and the specific capabilities of specific individuals were the decisive factors in whether the tradition survived and advanced or fractured and diminished. Den at the founding moment, Khasekhemwy at the hinge, Psamtik at the restoration, the Memphis priests at the Rosetta Stone crisis. Each of these was a specific moment when the tradition's survival depended on the specific quality of the human response to the specific challenge of the moment. What makes Egyptian civilization extraordinary is not simply its duration. It is the specific quality of the institutional intelligence that sustained it through the specific crises that its duration inevitably produced. The founders and the hinge holders and the restorers and the reconcilers, the specific individuals who did the specific work of institutional maintenance and development at the specific critical moments, are the real explanation of the civilization's extraordinary longevity. Khasekhemwy was one of the most important of these individuals. He stood at one of the most important of the critical moments, and his specific achievement, the reunification of the fractured kingdom, the theological innovation of the dual name, the building program that developed the institutional capacity for the pyramids, was the specific response that the specific challenge of his moment required. The deeper truth is that Egyptian civilization lasted 3,000 years because specific human beings made specific choices at specific critical moments. Khasekhemwy's choice to reconcile both powers, Horus and Seth, south and north, order and chaos, rather than simply declaring one victorious, was one of those choices. And the civilization that built the pyramids was one of its consequences. That is the deeper truth. And it is now visible, for whoever has followed this account to this point. The implications follow, and then the closing, and then the silence, which belongs not to Khasekhemwy, but to the 5,000 years of accumulated human achievement that his specific reign made possible. One final reflection on the deeper truth, which concerns what the archaeological record of Khasekhemwy's reign reveals about the specific relationship between crisis and institutional development in ancient civilizations. The Second Dynasty fracture was, from the perspective of the Egyptian state, a catastrophe. It disrupted the institutional continuity that the First Dynasty had built. It contested the legitimacy claims on which the unified state's authority depended. It presumably caused the deaths and displacements and institutional damage that any civil conflict produces. It was, from the inside, a period of genuine crisis, but from the perspective of the institutional tradition's long-term development, the fracture was also, and this is the uncomfortable truth that the evidence demands, a forcing function. The specific innovations that Khasekhemwy introduced, the dual name, the new administrative titles, the building program at unprecedented scale, the stone chambers in the tomb, were all, in different ways, responses to the specific challenges that the fracture and the reunification had created. The crisis forced the development of the specific institutional and ideological innovations that made the restored more capable than the state that had fractured. This does not make the fracture desirable. Civil conflicts are not desirable. The human cost of the Second Dynasty crisis, whatever specifically it was not a necessary price for the institutional development that followed. What it was, rather, was the specific historical circumstance within which a specific individual with specific capabilities deployed those capabilities in a specific way that turned a crisis into a foundation. Crises do not automatically produce this outcome. Most crises produce damage without producing the specific innovations that would transform the damage into a foundation for subsequent development. The specific outcome of the Second Dynasty crisis was the product of a specific individual response to it. Khasekhemwy's specific combination of military effectiveness, ideological creativity, and organizational intelligence. The crisis provided the conditions. Khasekhemwy provided the response. The response produced the foundation. The foundation produced the pyramids. That is the deepest truth of the deeper truth. The civilization's most extraordinary achievements grew from a crisis that a specific individual resolved with a specific intelligence that we can see, imperfectly but genuinely, in the evidence he left behind. The evidence is in the ground. The numbers are on the statues. The walls are still standing. And the name, Khasekhemwy, is available to anyone willing to speak it. Now the implications, and now the recognition that the evidence demands and the silence around this name has too long withheld. The Pharaoh at the hinge, the last ruler of the Second Dynasty and the first architect of the world that built the pyramids. The man whose name means the two powers appear and whose specific achievement in making those two powers appear. In the reconciled kingdom, the reunified state, the developed institutional capacity was the specific condition of possibility for everything that the Old Kingdom achieved. His name was Khasekhemwy. The deeper truth about what that name means is now visible. The implications follow. The implications are the subject of the next section. But before moving to them, one more element of the deeper truth deserves its explicit acknowledgement: the extraordinary durability of the physical evidence itself. The Shunet el-Zabib has been standing for more than 5,000 years. The statues in Cairo and Oxford have survived the fall of the Old Kingdom, the intermediate periods, the Hyksos invasion, the New Kingdom, the late period, the Persian conquests, the Greek conquest, the Roman period, the Byzantine period, the Arab conquest, the medieval period, and the modern era. They have survived because mud brick in the Egyptian desert is more durable than most stone in most climates, because limestone statues sealed in archaeological deposits are protected from the specific weathering processes that open-air monuments face, and because the specific accidents of preservation and discovery preserve the most important physical evidence just adequately enough for the modern scholarly tradition to recover it. These accidents of preservation are not guarantees. The First Dynasty and Second Dynasty royal tombs were looted in antiquity. Most of the organic material, most of the metal objects, most of the high-value portable objects are gone. What survived is what looters left behind. The stone vessels, the administrative ceilings impressed in clay, the mud brick architecture, the incised stone labels, the carved limestone statues. In the specific conditions of the Egyptian desert, these categories of material survive exceptionally well. They have, and in surviving, they have preserved enough of the story to tell it. Not all of the story, not the inner life of the man, not the specific details of the conflict, not the full range of what his court produced and what his administration managed, but enough to see the scale of what he built, enough to read the numbers on the statue bases, enough to recognize the administrative innovations that his reign introduced, enough to understand the architectural innovations that his building program developed, enough to know his name, enough to speak it with the full force of what it means. Khasekhemwy. The two powers appear. The implications follow. Step back from the specific story of Khasekhemwy and look at the full arc of the series that this account completes. This series has now examined 10 figures across the full span of Egyptian civilization. Den at the founding moment, Khasekhemwy at the hinge between the early period and the Old Kingdom, then, crossing the vast gap of the Old and Middle Kingdoms and the intermediate periods, the late period pharaohs of the Second Dynasty and the Ptolemaic rulers whose civilizational synthesis produced the Library of Alexandria, the Pharos Lighthouse, and the Rosetta Stone. Each account has been examining a specific individual at a specific moment in the tradition's arc. Each has found, in the specific evidence of the specific reign, the same underlying pattern. An individual applying specific institutional intelligence to specific challenges, producing specific contributions to the tradition's continuity and development, and doing so in a way that was consequential for the tradition's long-term trajectory, rather than simply significant for the immediate moment. What the full arc reveals, what becomes visible only when Den and Khasekhemwy and Psamtik and Ptolemy II and Ptolemy V are all part of the same picture, is the specific character of the institutional tradition that sustained Egyptian civilization for 5,000 years. The tradition was not a static thing. It was not simply a set of forms maintained unchanged across 3 millennia. It was a living institutional tradition, one that developed, advanced, was disrupted, was restored, was synthesized with other traditions, and eventually was transformed into something that preserved its most essential elements while becoming genuinely different from what it had been at the beginning. Den's founding forms and the Ptolemaic synthesis were not identical. They were expressions of the same tradition at different moments in its development, shaped by different circumstances, but connected by a continuous institutional thread that the specific individuals at the critical moments had sustained. The implication is not simply historical. It is about how civilizational traditions work, about the specific combination of institutional depth and individual intelligence that allows a tradition to sustain itself across the disruptions and transformations that time inevitably produces. The Egyptian institutional tradition had depth. 3,000 years of accumulated practice, accumulated knowledge, accumulated symbolic vocabulary, accumulated administrative forms. That depth gave it resilience, gave it the capacity to be disrupted and restored, to be fractured and reunified, to be conquered and continue, that the shorter and shallower traditions of its contemporaries typically did not have. But depth alone was not sufficient. The tradition also had specific individuals at specific critical moments who understood what the moment required and who had the specific capabilities to provide it. Den building the forms at the founding. Khasekhemwy reunifying after the fracture and building the foundation for the pyramids. Psamtik restoring after the Assyrian occupation. The Memphis priests at the Rosetta Stone crisis. Each of these individuals, and the many others whose accounts this series has told, was the specific human expression of the tradition's depth. They were not interchangeable. The tradition could not have simply produced any other person with equivalent capabilities at the same moment. What it could do was produce, across its broad institutional substrate, the conditions within which specific individuals with specific capabilities could deploy those capabilities most effectively. This is the most important implication of the full arc of this series, that civilizational continuity is neither automatic nor guaranteed, but is the product of the specific combination of institutional depth and individual excellence at critical moments. When both are present, when the tradition's accumulated depth is available as a resource, and when the specific individual has the intelligence and the capabilities to deploy that resource effectively, the tradition can survive crises that would destroy shallower institutions and can advance beyond the specific achievements of any previous generation. When one is absent, when the institutional depth has been depleted, or when the specific individual at the critical moment lacks the necessary capabilities, the tradition is vulnerable in ways that can be irreversible. The Second Dynasty fracture, which preceded Khasekhemwy, was a moment when the institutional depth was present, but the specific individual who could deploy it effectively had not yet arrived. Khasekhemwy was the arrival. For Khasekhemwy specifically, the implication of his account for anyone who manages or participates in a complex institution, any organization, any community, any tradition, is the specific implication about the role of the hinge moment. Hinge moments happen in every institution's history. They are the moments when the previous phase ends and the next phase begins, when the accumulated work of the previous generation needs to be gathered up and synthesized into the foundation for the next generation's achievements. The specific work of the hinge moment is different from the work of the building phase that follows. It requires the recognition of what has been broken and what needs to be restored. It requires the specific institutional intelligence to deploy the available resources toward the right priorities in the right sequence. And it requires the specific willingness to do the foundational, unglamorous, essentially invisible work, the mud brick laying, the administrative reorganization, the ideological reconciliation, that makes the visible achievements of the next phase possible. Khasekhemwy did this work. He did it in the specific conditions of a fractured ancient kingdom, using the specific tools of the early Egyptian institutional tradition, mud brick and stone and ivory seals, and the specific symbolic language of divine kingship. The specific tools were ancient. The specific problem he was solving was local to his time and place. But the character of the work he did, the hinge work, the foundational work, the essentially invisible work that made the next great phase possible, is recognizable in any institution at any moment when the previous phase ends and the next begins. That recognition is the most directly applicable implication of his account, and it is an implication that the silence around his name has consistently prevented from being available to the wider world. The silence is broken here. The recognition is now possible, and the closing, the final direct acknowledgement of who Khasekhemwy was and what his specific achievements meant, follows immediately. The specific place of this account in the series that has produced it requires one additional reflection. A reflection on what it means that a series examining the 5,000-year arc of Egyptian civilization has included both Den and Khasekhemwy, alongside the more familiar late period and Ptolemaic figures that the series began with. The inclusion was deliberate. Den and Khasekhemwy are not simply interesting figures who deserve more attention. They are the foundational figures, the people whose specific achievements are the preconditions for everything that the subsequent 3,000 years of Egyptian civilization produced. A series that examined only the late period and the Ptolemaic synthesis would be examining the latter portions of the arc without examining the arc's foundations. The foundations are essential for understanding the full character of what was built on them. The specific character of the Egyptian institutional tradition, the specific combination of divine kingship ideology, administrative systematization, and symbolic vocabulary that made it so durable, was established in its early form by Den and his predecessors and successors in the First Dynasty. It was preserved and advanced through the specific achievement of Khasekhemwy at the Second Dynasty hinge. It was maintained and restored by the late period pharaohs described in the earlier accounts in this series, and it was synthesized and transmitted by the Ptolemaic dynasty in the form that eventually gave the modern world back the ability to read everything that the tradition had ever written. That full arc, from Den's founding to the Rosetta Stone, is the arc this series has been tracing. Khasekhemwy is the second point on the arc, the first major hinge, the specific moment when the early foundations were consolidated and the trajectory toward the pyramid-building civilization was set. Understanding Khasekhemwy in this context, as the second foundational figure in the arc, the man who stood at the hinge between the early period and the Old Kingdom, changes how the entire series should be read. It is not simply a collection of accounts about interesting individual pharaohs. It is an account of a single civilizational tradition, traced through the specific individuals who most shaped its trajectory at the most critical moments of its 5,000-year history. Khasekhemwy shaped it at the moment when the early period's foundations were at their most fragile, when the fracture threatened to become permanent, when the institutional forms of the unified state were at risk, when the specific achievement of reunification and consolidation was the difference between a civilizational tradition that would sustain the Old Kingdom and one that would fragment into the regional kingdoms that Egypt had been before the First Dynasty. He reunified, he consolidated, he built, and the tradition survived to produce the pyramids and the New Kingdom and the late period Renaissance and the Ptolemaic synthesis, and, ultimately, the Rosetta Stone and the modern world's ability to read the full 5,000-year record of what that tradition had produced. His name was Khasekhemwy. The two powers appear, and now, through this series, the full arc of the tradition they appeared in, the tradition they helped to found and to preserve and to advance, is visible in something approaching its full scope. The arc is the achievement. The individuals at its critical moments are the specific agents of the achievement, and Khasekhemwy, at the hinge between the founding and the pyramids, is among the most important of those agents. The closing follows. Before the closing, one final observation about the series as a whole. These 10 accounts together have told the story of a civilization that lasted, in recognizable institutional form, from approximately 3000 BC to the fall of the last Ptolemaic ruler in 30 BC. That is approximately 3,000 years. No other ancient civilization achieved anything approaching this institutional continuity. No other tradition sustained the specific combination of administrative capacity, symbolic coherence, and territorial integrity for anything close to this duration. What sustained it was the specific combination of institutional depth and individual excellence at critical moments that this series has been tracing. Den built the forms. Khasekhemwy preserved them at the first great crisis. The subsequent 3,000 years added their own contributions and their own crises. And at the end of the arc, the Memphis priests inscribed a decree in 3 scripts on a stone that preserved the key to reading everything the tradition had ever written. The story is extraordinary. The people who made it extraordinary deserve to be known. Khasekhemwy is among them. His account is now complete. The closing follows, and with it, the series reaches the full extent of its arc. The full extent of the arc, from Den to the Rosetta Stone, from the founding of the forms to the crisis that preserved the key to reading them, from approximately 3000 BC to 196 BC. A span of approximately 2,800 years of continuous civilizational tradition, examined in 10 accounts, is the subject that this series has worked to illuminate. Khasekhemwy stands at the most critical hinge point of that span, the moment when the early foundations were most at risk, and when the specific achievement of reunification set the trajectory that the subsequent 3,000 years would follow. His account, given its full scope here, is the account of that hinge point and of the man who held it. The closing is now ready to be written, and it closes both this account and the full arc of the series. Ready. The closing follows now, the pharaoh at the hinge between 2 great civilizational periods, the last ruler of the Second Dynasty and the first architect of the world that built the pyramids, the man whose name means the 2 powers appear, and whose specific achievement in making those powers appear in a reunified, institutionally advanced, architecturally ambitious kingdom was the specific foundation of the Old Kingdom's extraordinary achievements. His account is complete. The recognition is given. The closing follows immediately. The Shunet el-Zabib is still standing. In the desert behind the town of Abydos, in the region of Upper Egypt, where the Nile Valley narrows and the cultivable land gives way to the limestone desert plateau, the great mud brick walls of Khasekhemwy's funerary enclosure rise against the sky, not as they were when they were built. 5,000 years of desert weathering and occasional flooding, and the slow slumping of unfired mud brick have taken their toll on the upper portions of the walls, rounding their edges and reducing their height in places. But the core of the structure, the massive mud brick bulk of the walls at their base, survives with an immediacy that is extraordinary for something this old. Stand at the foot of those walls, and you are standing at the foot of something built before the pyramids, before the step pyramid at Saqqara, before the smooth-sided pyramid at Midam, before the bent pyramid at Dahshur, before the red pyramid, before Khufu's great pyramid at Giza. All of those came after, this came before. The walls are still standing. They have been standing for more than 5,000 years. They will be standing for a long time to come, in the specific conditions of the Egyptian desert that are more forgiving of mud brick than most climates are of most materials. The desert protects what it surrounds, when it is not the desert that surrounds it. These walls were built by a specific man, in a specific moment of crisis, as the most ambitious demonstration of organizational capacity and divine royal authority that the ancient world had yet produced. They were built to sustain the mortuary cult of a king who had reunified a fractured kingdom, who had inscribed the numbers of his defeated enemies on the bases of his statues, who had incorporated both Horus and Seth into his royal name, who had built stone chambers in his tomb that anticipated the pyramids, and who had organized the most sophisticated administrative apparatus in the history of the early Egyptian state. They were built by Khasekhemwy, the last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty, the man at the hinge between the founding and the pyramids. The answer to the title question, who was Khasekhemwy, the last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty, is now as complete as this account can make it. He was the final ruler of Egypt's Second Dynasty, reigning at a period that current scholarly estimates place approximately 4,700 years ago. He came to the throne during or immediately after the most serious political fracture in the history of the early Egyptian state. A fracture whose specific causes remain debated, but whose general character appears to have involved a conflict between factions associated with the Horus tradition and those associated with the Seth tradition, reflecting a deeper conflict between regional or institutional interests within the newly unified kingdom. He reunified the Egyptian state through a military campaign whose outcome was commemorated in the carved enemy figures on the bases of his two limestone statues, found at Hierakonpolis by Quibel in 1897 CE and now held in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo and the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The numbers incised beside those figures, more than 47,000 counted, recorded on both statues independently, are the most direct surviving evidence for the scale of the conflict he resolved. He gave the reunified state a theological political foundation designed for maximum durability. The dual name that incorporated both Horus and Seth, declaring the two powers appear, and explicitly claiming the reconciliation of both divine traditions within his own royal authority. This was both a theological innovation, a new formulation of the pharaonic ideology designed for the specific political circumstances of the reunification, and a political act of the highest intelligence, refusing to declare either faction the defeated loser of the conflict, and thereby creating the broadest possible basis for the restored unity. He built the Shunet el-Zabib at Abydos, the largest mud brick structure that had yet been built anywhere in the world, still standing more than 5,000 years later, as the architectural demonstration of the restored state's organizational capacity and the institutional seriousness with which the royal mortuary cult would be maintained. He built the largest royal tomb in the history of the early period, incorporating for the first time in Egyptian royal tomb construction the systematic structural use of stone, anticipating in its stone chambers the architectural revolution that the step pyramid would complete. He developed the administrative apparatus of the reunified state to its highest level yet, introducing the title of vizier, the highest administrative office below the king, that would persist in the Egyptian institutional tradition for 3,000 years. He apparently fathered Djoser, the first ruler of the Third Dynasty, in whose reign Imhotep built the Step Pyramid. If this identification is correct, the institutional and material inheritance that made the pyramid possible was passed from father to son within a single family. Across the dynasty change that the scholars mark between the Second and the Third Dynasties, he died. He was buried at Abydos, in the largest royal tomb of the early period, in the stone-chambered burial space, whose architecture anticipated the pyramid complexes that his son and the subsequent rulers of the Third and Fourth Dynasties would build. His body has not survived the specific conditions of 5,000 years of Egyptian desert and the ancient looting of the tomb. What survives is the evidence of his presence, the architecture, the objects, the administrative records, the statues with their numbers, the walls of the Shunet el-Zabib. The walls are still standing. That is the most immediate and most powerful final word about Khasekhemwy that the evidence provides. Not his name in a papyrus document, not his image in a well-preserved painting, not his words recorded in a literary tradition that subsequent generations preserved. The walls, mud brick, 5,000 years old, still standing in the desert behind Abydos. They will be standing for a long time to come, longer, probably, than most of what is being built today. There is something in the specific character of Egyptian mud brick in the Egyptian desert that is almost indifferent to time, that will outlast most other building materials in most other climates by a margin so large that the comparison becomes almost philosophical. The walls Khasekhemwy built are a lesson in durability, not the durability of fame, which the silence around his name demonstrates is less reliable than the durability of mud brick, but the durability of the well-made physical thing, the thing built with good materials and good technique and sufficient scale to resist the specific pressures that time exerts on physical objects. Good materials, good technique, sufficient scale. These were the specific characteristics of everything Khasekhemwy built. The walls, the tomb, the administrative apparatus, the theological formulation that reconciled two divine powers, the institutional inheritance he left for the son who built the first pyramid, good materials, good technique, sufficient scale, and the two powers appearing in a name that deserves to be spoken with the full force of what it means. Think about what it means to build something 5,000 years ago that is still standing. Most of what any civilization builds does not last 5,000 years. Most of what is built today will not last 5,000 years. The specific combination of material and technique and scale and the specific conditions of the Egyptian desert that Khasekhemwy's buildings benefited from produced something extraordinary in its durability. But the most durable thing Khasekhemwy built was not the Shunet el-Zabib. It was the institutional inheritance he left, the administrative apparatus, the building traditions, the organizational capacity that his son deployed in building the first pyramid. The mud brick walls will outlast most things built since. The institutional inheritance outlasted the walls by another 2,000 years, sustaining the Egyptian civilizational tradition from the pyramids through the late period and the Ptolemaic synthesis to the moment when the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved at Philae. The walls are the visible legacy. The institutional inheritance was the lasting one, and both were products of the same intelligence, the same organizational capacity, the same governing wisdom, the specific qualities of a specific man who stood at the hinge between two great periods of Egyptian civilization and held it. His name was Khasekhemwy. He was the last pharaoh of the Second Dynasty. He held the hinge between the foundations and the pyramids. He built the conditions within which everything most recognizable about ancient Egyptian civilization became possible, and the walls he built are still standing. Now you know his name. Now you know what it means.